listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched on the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, and the only corner that you're going to have today, my name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm your indefatigable political analyst, and this is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Right on. Shane is not necessarily here today, but that's okay. We're still going to have a phenomenal show. We have a show full of great guests. Let's start off, however, as we typically start off, with the headlines. In the news. Yesterday, in the United States, there were 25,833 new COVID cases reported, with 1,878 deaths. Before I continue with that, keep in mind, over the course of weekends, the number, for whatever reason, reported and deaths tends to be much lower. And as we go through the course of the week, that number tends to spike. So the 1,800 number is actually rather shocking. If you go back and look at over the Mondays of the last several weeks, that number was much, much, much lower. And if it's starting off at 1,878, that bodes bad for the rest of the week. But however, let's keep moving. Yesterday, in the United States, there were 25,833 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,878 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 106,941 cases per day, a decrease from 28% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and now 65% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,658,161 people across the United States. And as I mentioned last week, we've hit the precipice of 700,000 with 701,326 senseless men, women, and children dead. I call it senseless because that number shouldn't be that high. In international news, millions of leaked documents have uncovered the truth of how current and former world leaders secure their finances. No country was exempt, with reports detailing the financial practices of leaders from Britain, Brazil, Ukraine, Ecuador, Russia, the United States, and many more. The files are being called the Pandora Papers. This is basically how the rich hide their wealth in order to dodge taxes and dodge their, you could say, social responsibility with the great amounts of cash that these guys have. They're basically hiding it offshore. In real estate and some of the other servings, these papers were astonishing, to put it mildly. Russia has successfully test-fired its hypersonic missile from a submarine. President Vladimir Putin has said the Zircon is capable of flying at 9 times the speed of sound and at a range of 1,000 kilometers, or for the American audience, 620 miles. In Earth and Science news, U.S.-based scientists David Julius and Artem Papatoin won a Nobel Peace Prize today for their research into the discovery of how the receptors that allow humans to feel temperatures and touch. Still learning about ourselves. It's great. A massive oil spill in California has sprayed crude oil through the water and on the beaches of Orange County coast in California. Law enforcement is looking into the matter, but they believe the culprit is an oil platform and reservoir named Ellie, 4.5 miles off the coast. The reservoir could still be leaking as divers are trying to learn more about the causes. In business news, the whistleblowers from Facebook who leaked thousands of internal Facebook documents to Wall Street Journal has identified herself as Frances Hagen. She stated to the media that Facebook over and over and over again has shown it chooses profit over safety. This comes after a scathing Wall Street Journal report showcasing the very harmful effects of the company and other apps on mental health. In holiday news, today is National Taco Day, National Vodka Day, and National Child Health Day. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. National Vodka Day. That is phenomenal. It's funny, during the COVID lockdown, one of the side effects, and you could say somewhat of a negative side effect, has extra weight gain, obvious reasons. People aren't necessarily taking their typical day of getting up, putting clothes on, going to work, coming back home, etc. For the most part, those people, especially the ones that are locked in their homes or stuck in their homes, well, it's eating without the level of physical exercise that you would typically get. And of course, being stuck in a house, there's something to say about issues of depression, issues of feeling blue, and those things that go along with feeling like you're just kind of dejected and separate from your world. And of course, that can lead to somewhat drinking. The catch here is the sliding door reality of this, though, is that we are over 700,000 people dead over the course of, a year and a half or more at this point. And so you can kind of see that, yeah, people may feel blue and people may gain weight, but that's compared to the number of people that have been dropping dead like flies and dropping dead in somewhat of a senseless fashion. Another news report that I want to get to, and we're going to be talking about this in a few minutes, 30 minutes or so with Carl Jha, has to do with provocation between Taiwan and China. Taiwan's foreign minister warns that his country is preparing for a war with China, and he's been asking the world leaders for basically help. Now, this comes as China has flown roughly 80 sorties near or over, I believe it's towards the south side of Taiwan. This took place over the weekend. It took place on Friday and Saturday. I haven't heard any reporting for it on Sunday. But this became one of those things where Taiwan is basically backed by the United States. The United States has been giving all sorts of weapons and munitions to Taiwan. And China considers Taiwan its territory. Now, this goes all the way back to just after the Second World War, where the communists basically take mainland China, the nationalists basically go to Taiwan. And for the longest time, we've had this one China policy that when Donald Trump came in, he flagrantly ignored, and ignored in such a way that created all sorts of hostilities between the United States and China in resolving and dealing with it. So that is going to be probably big news over the course of the weekend. Over the course coming forward in this coming week. The catch and the question always boils down to this thing of what does the United States think it could do if China decides to take Taiwan? And to be fair, it's very possible that the provocations that we're seeing here is in response to the weapons deals and everything else that the United States has been basically ignoring China's policy towards Taiwan. So we're going to be able to get into a larger conversation about this later in the morning. One of the other items that is on the mail and on the queue for today that we're going to be having a conversation about, that's going to be a quite good conversation. We have Ted Rawl to discuss it, and I'm really hoping Joel Siegel can join us for 15 minutes on this. But basically, Build Back Better. This is Biden's Build Back Better plan. Now, if you remember, this plan was supposed to be basically set. You had a $1.2 trillion, $1.3 trillion bipartisan bill between the two parties, between Republicans and Democrats. No issue with that one. Passes the Senate, goes into the House. The catch here is that the budget reconciliation was supposed to go along with it. Now, the budget reconciliation was $3.5 trillion, and that is the one that had the environmental issues, that had the expansion of Medicare, drugs, increasing taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That particular plan was agreed upon by the overwhelming majority of the party. Now, keep in mind, Democrats only have a very narrow window of control of the House and of the Senate. 50 votes in the Senate with maybe 3 votes that they can lose in the House. Well, for the most part, the House has the votes to pass the reconciliation bill. The Senate misses two members of Congress. Those 2 members, Kristen Sinema, and of course, Joe Manchin, West Virginia, Arizona. Now, let's be clear about a few things. West Virginia, Arizona, agrees with the president's plan on this, meaning the reconciliation, Biden's Build Back Better agenda, is popular across the board to the tune of like 70% or more. Even in places like West Virginia and Arizona, it is popular. In West Virginia, I think it had a 48% popularity, but the moment that you say, hey, we're using increasing taxes on the rich to pay for it, the numbers jump to nearly 70%. Sinema, instead of sticking with the negotiations, and again, at the very least, Joe Manchin has said, I'll do $1.5 trillion, meaning Joe Manchin has at least thrown out a number, even though the number is grossly insufficient. Sinema has been against all of it, meaning she's been against increasing taxes on the wealthy, and she has not necessarily even got across what she dislikes about the bill. She probably has been talking to her donors, because she's been basically going and having these meetings in Arizona. Over the weekend, she decided to blow off the negotiations that were taking place. She told the public, I have a medical appointment that I need to go and see about. She did not bring up the fact that she was going to see her donors and that they were going to be sticking dollars and checks in her G-string for basically for backing their agenda. It is an amazing thing. It's very rare to have this number of Democrats to basically be on the same side of an issue, meaning all of them, moderates, the left, etc., same page. Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, leadership is in this case in lockstep with the lefties that want to get this passed. Nancy Pelosi considers this going to be her agenda. She's not going to be in Congress much longer, or at the very least, she's not going to be leader much longer. Joe Biden, again, considers this his legacy. And when he's making these arguments about autarky and we have to fight for democracy and this is an economic challenge, that we're at an economic conflict with China, he is looking at the Build Back Better, this particular, what he considers to be transformative agenda, as an inflection point in American history. It's not that the left is pushing him on it. It's not that the left has any power to bend Biden into form. That's not it at all. The left has been marginalized for decades by the moderates in the party. This is what Biden wants, and that's the rub. The president of the United States wants this to be his legacy. He wants to be this. He wants this to be his agenda, and he considers this a transformative agenda at that. And whatever I think of Biden, I didn't vote for Joe Biden because I didn't necessarily believe Biden was going to live up to any kind of legitimate expectations. By the same token, he's right in saying that there is a lot of extraordinarily good stuff in this bill. And if this bill was the law of the land at the point where I was growing up, I would have had a very different childhood within degrees. I mean, there's a lot of cases where there has been a lot less suffering, a lot less heartache, and a lot less worry if this was the lay of the land when I was growing up. And I suspect that's going to be true for a lot of people. Even if you take one item, the Medicare for All issue, this notion that the bill is trying to expand Medicare and trying to lower the age of Medicare, not to mention drug costs, meaning allowing Medicare to basically negotiate for drug costs. Well, if you take that to where it is and expand it to eye, vision, and dental, you have a large number of people in this country who just go without, meaning they go without dental, they go without eye care. And those people, invariably, get worse as issues come up and they can't necessarily afford to get those items attended to. This would expand it to like 40 million people. That is dramatic. No, it is not Medicare for all. That is perfectly fair to say. But despite it not being Medicare for all, it is still substantial. And if you can expand eye coverage, expand teeth coverage or dental coverage, and lower the age of the people that are viable for it, that is a big, big deal that would have dramatic consequences for a lot of people in this country. You know, my position is that Medicare for all should be the lay of the land in this case. By the same token, Joe Biden had made it very clear that he would have vetoed Medicare for all, which is just maddening, to put it mildly, especially during a pandemic where 700,000 Americans have dropped dead. By the same token, let's be very clear that between Medicare for all and nothing, this is still rather substantial. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with I am typically joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan. He's not here today. He's not feeling all that well. Nevertheless, we're going to keep this show moving. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Attorney Stephen Donziger, who won the $9.5 billion lawsuit in Ecuador against Chevron in 2011 on behalf of 30,000 farmers and indigenous people, was sentenced on Friday to 6 months in prison by the United States court. This was astonishing on multiple counts. For one, Donziger had been in detention, basically at home, for over 2 years, something in and of itself that was astonishing. But you also had this other weird quirk all throughout the case, that he wasn't convicted by a jury, nor was he convicted by the U.S. government. He was basically attacked, or they went after him with a prosecution of lawyers connected to Chevron. Yes, the same company where he won the $9.5 billion lawsuit against. It was basically a punitive prosecution in the United States for something that they lost in Ecuador. This case was astonishing on several fronts. Many of the people that were involved in the case were connected to Chevron. Donziger wasn't necessarily able to put up a legitimate defense. And even just recently, from the standpoint of what they put him in prison for, he didn't give up his documentation, meaning computers and documentation associated with the case, which is basically what they wanted. And they basically had him in contempt of court. This is Stephen just before the verdict, or just before the trial. I believe this was the day before he went to get his sentence. Let's play the clip.
Hey everybody, it's that time. Tomorrow I'm being sentenced after being in house arrest for 2 years and 2 months, unlike any other lawyer in American history. I'm not going to lie, it's a tough night for me and my family. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know if when I walk into the courthouse in the morning I'm going to be walking out after the sentencing hearing. I think I will be, but I'm not 100% sure. But I want to say this, we built tremendous momentum. This week the United Nations ruled, with a ruling of 5 international jurists, that my entire detention is arbitrary and illegal, and they ordered the U.S. government to release me and to pay me compensation. Now, I don't know if Judge Preska is going to pay attention to that decision or not. I think there's other reasons she should release me, that I've now served 8 times the longest sentence ever given a lawyer for my offense. But we're feeling good going in. We have a lot of momentum. If things don't work out tomorrow and Judge Preska remands me to jail, you're not going to be hearing from me for a while. It might be a day or two until the appellate court steps in, or it could be months until I serve my entire sentence. I have no way of knowing. So if you do not hear from me, know that behind closed doors, I will be thinking of you, thinking of all of the support, thinking of our movement, and knowing that hopefully when I get out, we'll be able to pick up this work even stronger than we are now. I'm going to need people to pay attention to our elected representatives, to call out Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Merrick Garland, my elected representatives, Jerry Nadler, Chuck Schumer, Kirsten Gillibrand. They need to pay attention. They need to be forced to pay attention to this human rights violation. So just understand how appreciative I am of all the support and the love and the messages. We're going in tomorrow hopeful, respectful, and hoping that Judge Preska will do the right thing and release me for time served, given the extraordinary length of time I've been in my home. Thank you very much, and hopefully you'll be hearing from me after sentencing tomorrow.
That was Stephen, and he's right on several counts. In 2019, he was charged for contempt of court for not giving over, again, stuff that you would think is work product and think is not legally right to give over, meaning your computer, your things that you were basically using for your lawsuits, not to mention attorney-client privilege. And they kept him in his house for over 2 years. Again, he mentioned 2 years, 2 months. Preska paid no attention, which is the judge that's on this case, to the UN working group. What again, he mentioned the UN working group on arbitrary detention, a body of 5 international jurists and human rights experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council. And they basically made the point and concluded that, quote, the court's extended pretrial detention of Mr. Donziger is arbitrary under international human rights standards and therefore unlawful. The group found very serious violations of numerous articles of international covenant on civil political rights, along with appalling violations of the UN basic principles on the role of lawyers. They made the point that the remedy for this is to release Stephen immediately and accord him with enforceable rights to compensation and other reparations. As he made mention, Preska paid no mind to this, didn't care one iota that this was appalling and a breach of human rights. And she makes the point in her ruling, quote, it seems that the only proverbial 2x4 between the eyes would instill in him a respect for the law, unquote. The law, decidedly, has very little to do with this. Human rights, justice, all of that has nothing to do with this. And understand what we're saying here. The United States government basically chose not to push this case. Instead, they ended up getting a corporate lawyer with connections to Exxon to basically punitively go after Donziger. And to make that point that much more clear, he had no out in this situation. And he wasn't convicted by a jury of his peers. And yes, he had already been in his own home, locked in his own home for 2 years under contempt, something that is unfounded, unseen, and has never before happened, especially with the prosecution not being done by the U.S. government, but being done by a company lawyer. Let's hear Greg Palast. Greg Palast was covering this, and he was there at the sentencing. Let's play the clip.
Stephen Donziger, human rights lawyer, has just been sentenced to 6 months in prison. Donziger is the lawyer who successfully brought a $9.5 billion lawsuit against Chevron Corporation, where they were found guilty of poisoning the natives of the Amazon in Ecuador and destroying the rainforest. Chevron's never paid, but Donziger's now paying with 6 months in prison for supposed contempt of court. He was prosecuted for the first time in U.S. history, not by the U.S. Justice Department, but by a private attorney who worked for Chevron, the first corporate prosecution in America sending a man to prison. No jury trial. Stephen Donziger, human rights lawyer, 6 months in prison. This is Greg Palast reporting from in front of federal court, Manhattan, New York.
Think of how extraordinary that is. I mean, on several counts. Again, this wasn't a federal prosecution but that pushed us through. This was basically a Chevron lawyer that went after the case. And more importantly, Chevron loses the case to $9.5 billion and decides to go on basically a campaign to destroy Donziger's life. And they were basically able to do it. We were fortunate to have him on the show multiple times to talk about the case. And every time he opens his mouth about the case, I am floored that this is allowed and that our, I guess you can say, system of justice, quote unquote, almost ironically said at this point, would allow somebody to basically be prosecuted and assaulted and attacked by a private law firm or an oil company that is basically trying to destroy his reputation because they basically lost in their lawsuit. Also, think about the precedent this sets. Any company that is dumping products in other countries, especially, let's say, poorer countries, where they have much more leverage, maybe because those countries have this sort of influence that they have in those countries or whatever. But the people who are bringing that lawsuit saying, look, they are dumping stuff. Our kids are getting sick. Our water is being contaminated. Our environment is being contaminated. Do something. He wages a decade-long war and wins. What is the precedent when a company, after losing a lawsuit like this, can turn around and basically attack the person who was instrumental in winning that lawsuit? And not just attacking them where they were, but even coming to the home country in order to do so and finding a judiciary that's amenable to it. because they have connections to the same company that just lost that race. Right here, beginning 1993, Dosinger and a group of other lawyers brought a class action lawsuit against Texaco on behalf of 30,000 farmers and indigenous people, charging that the company's oil drilling in the Amazon had resulted in massive contamination. After a visit to the region, Dosinger said that he saw at times, quote, what honestly looked like an apocalyptic disaster, including children walking barefoot down oil-covered roads and jungle lakes filled with oil. Due to the work done by Dosinger, the region became known as Amazon Chernobyl. Think about that for the moment, and think about what that means. And for a company to basically lose, even on appeal, meaning it was confirmed all the way through, and they were able to basically try to destroy his reputation, destroy his name, to try to make him look like a criminal in the process, to somehow subvert and undermine the verdict. This is a horrible, horrible precedent. And the idea that this could take place anywhere, let alone in the United States, is a disturbing eventuality about what this means. Is this going to be the playbook going forward? Meaning, in countries where Amazon, or in countries where oil companies, or for that matter, take any other company that is dumping waste and dumping material into those companies, into those countries. And when a prosecution legally is successful against them in order for them to pay reparations for the damage that they've done to those countries, is this going to be the playbook from here on out, where corporations basically get their judges and get their lawyers and people who can basically go after the heroes in this case in order to destroy them for doing so? What effect would this have on those type of prosecutions? Now, Dosinger has been very strong in this, making the point of saying, look, the only reason they're doing this is because I was successful. And he doesn't necessarily want others to back away from going after these companies for the things that they've been doing in these other countries. By the same token, let's be very clear and very honest. On some level, this will have a chilling effect if this is allowed to go forward without any consequences and without anything being done in order to make this right. And I guess the question becomes, is it even possible to make this right? Judge Preska put him in prison for 6 months. Your palace. This wasn't a jury trial. And more importantly, the person and every person along the way in a position of authority had connections to the oil company that basically lost the $9.5 billion lawsuit. This is an unfortunate reality, and my heart goes out to him. It's disturbing, to put it mildly. It's disturbing on the environmental front. It's disturbing on a legal front. And as the UN group on arbitrary detention made the point, it is appalling. The very serious violations is somewhat of an understatement. And Preska, again, paying no mind to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, threw him in prison. Our heart goes out to him on this show. And we've covered it multiple times. You can always go back and look at the episodes where Dosinger was on the show, where he could explain in detail what took place, why this was taking place, his expectations on this trial going forward. And as he said, you're probably not going to see him in a while, especially because of the sentence. But at the very least, he's not alone, at least in spirit. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a few minutes, a couple of minutes.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined typically with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of our station in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned early on in the headlines, there's been this odd provocation that's been taking place between China and Taiwan. Basically, on Friday, China flew 38 military aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. And on the day after that, they sent 30 warplanes towards Taiwan. As you know, the United States has basically been bolstering Taiwan's military capabilities, despite the fact that China considers Taiwan part of China in this one China policy. This is creating a certain degree of friction that the U.S. State Department, Ned Price, has started to, let's say, bellyache about, to put it mildly, and has started to throw up all sorts of consternation. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Carl Jha. Carl Jha is host of Silk and Steel podcast focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. Carl, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for inviting me again.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, you're an expert on this stuff, and we've always appreciated your insight into the issues pertaining to China in general. One of my subscribers sent me this over the weekend because he was very concerned that this could lead to a larger provocation. And the interesting thing, Daniel Ellsberg made the point. He's the one who released the Pentagon Papers. He noted that U.S. policy at the time was willing to basically go into a larger war over Taiwan. And Ellsberg's point in this was, you know, what is the military policy now, and how far would the United States go with this notion of trying to defend Taiwan? So from your take on this, what is going on that China is flying these airplanes or the warplanes towards Taiwan? And does this have anything to do with the U.S., I'm going to say, provocation by basically giving these guys weapons despite the fact of the one China policy?
Okay, first, I want to get one thing clear, because in a lot of the news report, they cite Chinese military planes invading Taiwan airspace. So it gives people the impression that somehow Chinese fighter planes is flying over the city of Taipei. You know, people are looking up and they see Chinese fighter planes everywhere. That is not true. China is not flying over fighter jets over the island of Taiwan. It's flying over what Taiwan calls its ADIZ, which is the Air Defense Identification Zone. Now, the Air Defense Identification Zone is something that's unilaterally declared by a country to supposedly safeguard its security. Now, none of these news reports about China supposedly invading Taiwan airspace shows you a map of the actual Taiwan ADIZ zone. So people can go to the Wikipedia, go to the entry for Air Defense Identification Zone. There's actually an entry for Taiwan. They have a map of the Taiwan ADIZ zone. And just take one look, you will see how ridiculous this zone is being drawn. And half of it is literally over the mainland China provinces of Fujian and Zhejiang. I'm talking about not just over Taiwan Strait. It's over the space above the mainland China land, right? So and people are saying, wait a minute, you know, like so what are they talking about in the news report? Again, the news report, they never show you a map or a flight path of these PLA fighter planes. But luckily for us, the Taiwan's Ministry of Defense, they have a verified Twitter account, and they tweet out every day the flight path of the PLA fighter planes into the so-called Taiwan ADIZ zone. And if I can even I can give you their Twitter handle so people can go see. It's the Taiwan Ministry of National Defense, ROC. It's at MON Defense. That is the official verified Twitter of Taiwan Ministry of Defense. And every day they plot out the map of the PLA aircraft over supposedly intrusion into Taiwan's ADIZ zone. And if you take a look at these maps, it's most of them shows that this flight path of the PLA military aircraft flies nowhere near the island of Taiwan. If anything, they fly closer to the coast of mainland China than the island of Taiwan itself. So let's just get that out of the way. China is not flying over fighter bomber jets directly over the island of Taiwan, not even close.
I'm glad that you explained that, because you're right. Oftentimes they don't necessarily get that across in regards to, okay. And what's funny too, the U.S. typically engage in, freedom of navigation exercises without any care or concern about the other countries that are involved. From your standpoint, though, I mean, you would agree that the number of flights have increased, though. I mean, whether it's over Taiwan or close to it. What's the reason for the escalation in the number of flights?
Right. So, and let's just give people a little bit of historical context, right? So up to 1960, I mean, in 1950s, Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek's KMT government used to fly its Air Force based in Taiwan to do bombing runs in Shanghai. That's 1950. It's because for longest time, the mainland China, they didn't have an Air Force that could answer the Air Force was built up in Taiwan with the help of U.S. military. That tip of balance only changed in 1960s after Soviet Union did a technology transfer to transfer the technology of MiG fighters to China. And since then, since 1960s, the balance had been shifting, and China still maintained an air superiority way into 1980s. But with the rise of China, that military balance have completely shifted. Now, if you look at the actual the flight path of the PLA military aircraft activity, it's a very careful. It's very carefully plotted. They made sure they went into the so-called Taiwan ADIZ zone, which is their way of telling Taiwan they think this ADIZ zone is BS. But then again, they intentionally plotted their flight path so a way it's kind of skirting around the edge. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's still close to those military aircraft runs. Still make close to the Chinese mainland coast. So in a way, it's not overly provocative, let's say, like flying directly over Taipei. At the same time, it's challenging the Taiwan's ADIA zone, which is totally ridiculous in its scope. And at the same time, it's very careful not to appear too aggressive. Yeah. But of course, that's not what the narrative is being told in the U.S. media. U.S. media is pushing this narrative that large number of Chinese aircraft regularly violate Taiwan airspace. Now, this is kind of like I say, it's China's way of saying we do not respect this Taiwan so-called ADIZ, which is drawn totally ridiculous. At the same time, China is playing a very restrained game. Yeah. It's only skirting around the edge of these zones. It's not penetrating deep into Taiwan airspace. Like, for example, do a run across the Taiwan island, which would be considered much more provocative and probably cause panic on the island. That's not the information we're getting from the U.S. media, first of all. But it is China's way of sending a message to show Taiwan's, look, we have the capability of doing so. Especially compared to the past, compared to 1950s when Taiwan regularly sends its aircraft to mainland and do bombing run. Again, this in 2021, these PLA aircraft are not doing any bombing runs. Right. They're just flying around the edge of the Taiwan ADIA zone to challenge it.
Basically, China's version of freedom of navigation, freedom of flight. In this case, this is Ned Price. Ned Price gave a statement because you're right. They're not necessarily disambiguating what is taking place. I mean, it comes across, if you just read the media or just hear it, it comes across as if, oh, these guys are just overflying Taiwan. This is so provocative, etc. The United States is very concerned about the People's Republic of China's provocative military activity near Taiwan, which is destabilizing, risks miscalculation, and undermines regional peace and stability. We urge Beijing to cease its military, diplomatic, and economic pressure and coercion, I love that one, against Taiwan. This was Ned Price, State Department spokesman. What's your comments to that? I mean, some of this stuff is pretty rich and radically hypocritical when you hear the United States says this. I mean, if you look at the way we treated Venezuela, if you look at the way we treated Iran, I mean, coercion and bellicosity is an understatement in this case. The key difference here is China doesn't consider Taiwan a separate entity, correct?
Well, neither does United States recognize Taiwan as a separate country, because U.S. does not have an official embassy in Taipei. As most of the country in the world, there's only a handful of the country in the world, mostly countries in Africa and Latin America, because Taiwan gives them generous loans and grants and then lots of money basically to pay them to recognize Taiwan diplomatically. But United States or none of its major Western allies recognize Taiwan as an independent country, because none of them maintain a official embassy in Taipei. And again, this is so from China's and U.S. actually made a joint communique with China in 1970s when after Nixon visited China to recognize, the PRC's claim to be the sole legitimate government of China, which basically, negates Chiang Kai-shek's claim, the similar claim on in Taiwan, and at the same time. U.S. was trying to maintain, for a long time, U.S. trying to maintain the so-called the strategic ambiguity, because at the same time that the U.S. upholds its one China policy, U.S. is also, Congress also passed the Taiwan Relationship Act, which supposedly pledged U.S. aid to Taiwan's defense. And that enables the U.S. military industrial complex to keep on selling Taiwan very expensive military gadgets over the years. And the statement about provocation is rich, especially coming from the United States, because the PRC foreign policy of PRC foreign ministry can literally just change the words around and replace China with U.S. and Taiwan with South China Sea, to talk about the U.S. freedom of navigation. It's the same. It's very provocative to send all this military hardware into proximity of China and to actually escalate a chance of miscalculation and possibly conflict.
I mean, not to mention AUKUS, that deal that came forward, even the assistance on Japan, like putting all of those missiles and weapons on Japan. I'm curious, when did this start? Because as you noted before, this kind of strategic ambiguity, or for that matter, this kind of one China policy that the United States, for the longest time, apparently, at the very least, accepted, even if it was selling Taiwan weaponry, it's still on some level, it's like making contacts to Taiwan was kind of off the reservation. The reason I ask this is because when Trump got in office and Trump called Taiwan, it was seen as a massive jump of the shark. But since then, the policy seemed to have gotten that much more, let's say, normalized. Was Trump the first, I guess, demarcation point from the one China policy? Or was there something going on prior to Trump taking office? Is this kind of the Asian pivot?
So the strategic ambiguity was a long-standing tradition in U.S. since 1972, since the Nixon visit to China. What have changed under Trump is, immediately after he take office, he made a call to the Taiwanese leader, Tsai Ing-wen, and that is a big break in the protocol. Again, U.S. State Department at some point had to come out and saying, it's not making any dramatic change to the one China policy. But then again, Trump sent its health czar to Taiwan to ostensibly talking about Taiwan's entry into WTO, not the WTO, I'm sorry, WHO, right? And this is also seen by China as U.S. trying to find a creeping way of granting Taiwan international recognition. And as you mentioned, Biden, since assuming office, hasn't really stepped back from all the Trump rhetoric and Trump stance. I mean, the only thing we have seen so far is the most recent release of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou by Canada after U.S. Justice Department decide to forego the case. I mean, maybe we're seeing some effort of trying to cool off the U.S.-China tension. I mean, hopefully that's an encouraging sign. But at the same time, not great deal has moved since the Trump went fully hardline anti-China. And hopefully, I'm hoping, but what Biden is trying to do is trying to use the Trump stance as a negotiation chip to try to wrangle more concession from China before fully normalize relationship again. I'm hoping, but we know that U.S. military-industrial complex has a lot of inertia, and I don't really know if Biden can really put that under his control. So at this point, we can all hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And I think so. At this point, it's still a lot of war of words, right? It's the U.S. accusation, even though they fully understand what is actually going on, they are fully engaged in this war of rhetorics. And again, still continue the posture of sending aircraft carrier groups into South China Sea and surrounding regions to maintaining the pressure on China.
Are you concerned?
I think.
Well, I was just going to ask: are you concerned with an escalation to this? I mean, and I guess that question goes in two fronts. Are you concerned that the U.S. gets further involved? Meaning, if they're like right now, we're sending weapons and we're kind of doing this kind of war word stuff. Are you concerned with a further escalation, either from the standpoint of China or from the standpoint of the U.S. getting further involved in Taiwan after, I guess, the flights?
Right. I think it's I don't foresee immediate escalation, but we haven't really backed down from this path of escalation. I don't think either side, China or U.S., are actively planning or intentionally get into an armed conflict. But the fear is that unplanned accident could happen when you have all these military hardware in close proximity to each other. One missile misfiring could potentially touch off the World War III, right? And that is something that's very dangerous. And I don't see, at least nobody is talking publicly about what is a path of de-escalation. There's a lot of talking about path to escalation. In fact, 60 Minutes Australia just a couple of weeks ago came out with a special on war with China, talking about what Australia should do in case of a war between U.S. and China over Taiwan specifically. And in a way, I can't help but to think this is a way of preparing the Western public to psychologically for a possible, scenario of war with China over Taiwan. But I'm hoping I'm wrong, but it is worrying.
Do you think the United States would get involved in order to defend Taiwan? I mean, I know Ellsberg kind of made mention that nuclear war, or at the very least this kind of nuclear deterrent in protection of Taiwan, but this was back, I believe, in the 60s or something to that effect. What about now? Do you think that the U.S. would really, I don't want to say instigate, but do you think they would come to Taiwan's assistance if indeed there was a larger provocation where China, or let's say some red line was crossed? And maybe this is two questions. What is a red line on Taiwan for China? That's the first point.
A great question. I mean, the whole point of U.S. strategic ambiguity is not to answer that question explicitly. Right. And so to U.S. like to keep its option open, but at the same time, U.S. is flexing its muscles around the Chinese coast to show that it has capability of intervening. Whether the U.S. has a will to intervene, I think that's a completely another question. I mean, U.S. especially when most of the U.S. public can't tell the difference between Taiwan and Thailand. I know that's true because I live in U.S. for 30 years, and that's my experience. And, U.S. will, well, then again, U.S. government has been able to sell war, over Libya and and Iraq and Afghanistan to its public with no problem. But China is much, much, much larger than Iraq or Afghanistan. And China has nuclear weapons. The difference between 1960s is China exploded its first nuclear device in 1964, and it hasn't looked back. So China, at this current stage, has the capability of striking mainland U.S., and it has enough nuclear warheads to survive the first strike and to do a retaliation strike against U.S. So, again, the question is, what is U.S. willing to sacrifice to keep Taiwan from China, to keep Taiwan from mainland China control? And again, this, I need to stress, nobody's talking about the path of de-escalation. There's a lot of talk about path of escalation. If China does this, if China wipe out a U.S. aircraft carrier group, maybe we should get to use lob or tactical nuclear weapons. But nobody's answered the question, what happens if we use tactical nuclear weapons in, either against a target around China or in China? What if China do a retaliatory nuclear strike? Then what happens? Then nobody is answering that question, and nobody is even talking about a plan of de-escalation. So right now they're playing a game of chicken, right? And they're playing game of nuclear chicken right now. That's what's happening.
That's so disturbing. I mean, because you make a really good point. Is the United States willing to lose, 10 million people in defense of Taiwan? That's not really asked. That's not really asked at all. In fact, and maybe that should be asked in this case. From China's point of view, what is a red line in regards to the U.S. working with Taiwan? I mean, because I would imagine there has to be at some point. Meaning there has to be something that takes place where China says, yeah, this is a no, and this is a hard no, and we will take action the moment that this line is crossed. What would that be in relation to either the U.S. Army Taiwan or the U.S. assistance to Taiwan?
Well, from China's point of view, China has been very clear from the beginning. If any government on Taiwan officially declares independence, that would be the red line crossed, because as China has lived with a status quo with Taiwan for over 70 years, and right now, time is on China's side, because as each year pass, China is growing stronger economically and militarily. So the balance is tipping in China's favor. I don't want to be cliche, but in the art of war, Sun Tzu said the best way to win a war is without a battle. Right now, China is winning the war without a battle. It's growing stronger and stronger. There is a fear, there is urgency on the U.S. side, though, because many national security establishment folks in U.S. recognize that fact. And they recognize they have a very limited time window in which U.S. can do anything to confront China. And they believe that that time window is in next between 5 to 10 years. And there is a fear that some people in the military industrial complex decided that U.S. need to act within that window to put a stop to China's rise and use Taiwan as a trigger point, and that then we're going to be in very, very dangerous waters. But from China's perspective, the red line has always been if the government on Taiwan declare independence, right? And that again, Taiwan is not a fully sovereign country in the way that any government in Taiwan would never do something like declaring independence without explicit support from the United States. So U.S. plays a very important role here. So if U.S. decide to tell Taiwan, hey, go ahead and declare independence, we'll back you up 100%. And then if the Taiwan's government went ahead and declared independence, that will be the red line.
But they know what that would mean. I mean, that's pretty significant. I'm curious, from your standpoint, just from your own take on this, at what point does a country independent? And I'm fascinated by this question. And it's not just with Taiwan. I mean, even going with Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, between, when that conflict was taking place. And, these guys wanted to have a certain level of independence associated with it. There's seems to be all sorts of provocations around the world on countries who want to be separate and distinct from, let's say, a larger country. At what point should that take place? I mean, is Taiwan, is Taiwan sufficiently different, be it culturally, be it, tenor, that it could be its own independent country? Meaning, what's go for it, please.
The question really is, why is this an issue on Taiwan? And the answer is domestic politics, because Taiwan for many years have been ruled by KMT, which was a party that lost out in the Chinese Civil War and fled mainland and ran to Taiwan. And you ruled in Taiwan as a military dictatorship for many years. And the current reigning party, the DPP, came to power after they defeated KMT in election. For DPP, they need to present China as a great other. The ones that send these KMT soldiers come over to rule over Taiwan for many decades. But again, even as an election domestic issue, even when DPP came to power in Taiwan, this is not the first time that DPP assumed the office of presidency in Taiwan. They have done actually very little to actually move toward independence because, again, like you said, they understand what that means. The rhetorics of declaring independence and getting the Taiwan international recognition is very important for Taiwan domestic election issues, but that's where it stops because they also all understand what it means if Taiwan actually goes ahead and declare independence, that would violate the red line declared by PRC government. So what we have seen is that they play this word game. For example, both DPP and KMT on Taiwan, both parties claim that Taiwan it's already independent. It's Republic of China on Taiwan. It's the current. They don't have to change anything because it's an independent country because they are running. They have their own military. They have their own. They're holding elections. They have own government structure, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't have to go officially declare independence because ROC already exists. So that's a way of justifying the status quo because and again, but again, to the domestic politics in Taiwan, there's that divide between the KMT and their supporters, especially a lot of the mainlanders who came with the KMT after 1949, after the KMT lost Civil War, and the so-called Bensen or the Taiwan provincials who were already on the island before 1949. So DPP plays that the identity politics and that is just politics.
Yeah.
Again, like the Taiwan current status quo, it has been going on for 70 some odd years, and as long as Taiwan don't unilaterally declare independence, make an official statement, I don't foresee any immediate military action from PRC.
I see.
But if they do, then yeah, all bets are off.
That would basically be the red line that they cross over, and China would take more aggressive action or provocative action in order to bring them into the fold. Very interesting. Carl, thank you, man. I really appreciate this. Carl Jha is host of Silk and Steel podcast, focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. You can follow Carl on Twitter @Carl Jha. Follow the podcast on Twitter @SteelSilkN, and subscribe to support his podcast on patreon.com/Silk and Steel. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We will be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left and only corner this morning, I'm your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas, and that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Alrighty, very interesting conversation with Carl. Carl knows his stuff on China, and when this was coming out over the weekend, the first question was, okay, how bad is this actually, and what is basically taking place? And Carl is able to give all sorts of background detail and kind of give the reality of the politics in the region. So shout out to Carl Zhao. Thank you for the short notice visit. But let's get to the headlines. In the news, yesterday, in the United States, there were 25,833 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,878 deaths. As I mentioned the first time around, oftentimes over the weekend, let's say that first Monday, the number of cases reported are very, very low for some reason. I don't know if that's just a reporting issue over the weekend. Oftentimes, the number of deaths are also low. Again, somewhat of a reporting issue. In this one, though, the reporting number is low, 25,833, but the number of deaths are still rather high, 18,078. And the catch becomes, how does this bode for the rest of the week if they're starting off at 1,878? Over the past week, there's been an average of about 106,941 cases per day, a decrease of 28% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 65% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,654,161 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 701,326 human beings. Thailand's government is in talks with the United States drug manufacturer Merck & Company for purchasing 200,000 of their experimental COVID-19 antiviral pills. South Korea and Malaysia have also expressed interest in following suit. Now, just in case you don't know, this pill is not NOT, some kind of new version of ivermectin. This is not a horse dewormer or anything like that. This is basically a new development in regards to pills to try to deal with COVID. One of the interesting things in the way that they were trying to test this pill, they would find people who had family members that were ill from COVID, and they would give other family members that were in the household that hadn't necessarily been affected with it the pills, with the idea of seeing whether or not it could lower the risk of those people catching COVID. It was finding good results. In some cases, I heard or was reading, they were calling it somewhat of a breakthrough. So we'll see. Millions of leaked documents have uncovered the truth about how current and former world leaders secure their finances. No country was exempt, with reporters detailing the financial practices of leaders from Britain, Brazil, Ukraine, Ecuador, Russia, the United States, and many more. The files are called the Pandora Papers, and you're going to be hearing more about that over the course of the week, and we're going to try to get someone here to discuss it tomorrow. Russia has successfully test-fired its hypersonic missile from a submarine. President Vladimir Putin has called the Zircon is capable of flying at 9 times the speed of sound with a range of 1,000 kilometers, or for the American audience, 620 miles. In Earth and Science news, U.S.-based scientists David Julius and Artem Patapoutian won a Nobel Peace Prize today for their research into the discovery of how the receptors that allows humans to feel temperature and touch. A massive oil spill in California has sprayed crude oil through the water and onto the beaches of Orange County, coast of California. Law enforcement is looking into the matter, but believe the culprit is an oil platform and reservoir named Ellie, 4.5 miles off the coast. The reservoir could still be leaking as divers are trying to learn more about the causes. The whistleblower from Facebook who leaked thousands of internal Facebook documents to the Wall Street Journal has identified herself as Frances Hagen. She stated to the media that Facebook over and over and over again has shown it chooses profits over safety. This comes after a scathing Wall Street Journal report showcasing the very harmful effects the company and others have on mental health. In other news, similar to what we were speaking with Carl Jha, the State Department, this is the Hill, the State Department said on Sunday that the United States is very concerned about China's, quote, provocative military activity near Taiwan following Beijing's most recent show of air power near the self-governing island. On Friday, China flew 38 military craft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. On Saturday, it sent 30 warplanes, again, into the identification zone. One of the interesting things that Carl Jha made the point about, though, is this is not necessarily over Taiwan proper, and it is not flying military planes over Taipei, that the identification zone goes further out, and that this is almost like a freedom of navigation exercise. In this case, instead of it being the United States being provocative in the South China Sea, it is basically China doing this over a zone that it doesn't necessarily consider as Taiwan's. In holiday news, today is National Taco Day, today is National Vodka Day, and today is National Child Health Day. That should be every day, to be honest. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. As I also made mention earlier today, and I did my monologue on this because I considered it a really big deal, attorney Stephen Donziger has been sentenced to 6 months for contempt of court in a vindictive case brought by Chevron. And again, this case is astonishing on so many fronts. The main astonishment, well, there are a few. One, Chevron loses a case for $9.5 billion in Ecuador. Doesn't pay up for this. This case has been validated over and over and over again as being legit. Chevron brings a case against Donziger in the United States, and this is where all the hysteria starts to take place. One of the judges tries to get him to give over his basically documentation, computers and other information that's associated with the case. Now, this breaches attorney-client privilege and seems greatly improper, and he was filing an appeal against this when she hits him with contempt of court and sentences him to house arrest for over 2 years. Again, an astonishing amount of time for house arrest for basically what they're hitting him with. The contempt of court charges were not being backed up by the U.S. government, by the way. Under normal circumstances, you would think that the U.S. government would say, okay, we will take this and we will go with it. That is not how this took place. They basically got a lawyer with associations with Chevron to prosecute Donziger. Utterly astonishing. And if I'm not mistaken, this has never taken place before. A day before he was sentenced, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the WGAD, which is a body of 5 international jurists and human rights experts appointed by the UN Human Rights Council, concluded, quote, this court's extended pretrial detention of Mr. Donziger is arbitrary under international human rights standards and therefore unlawful. The group found, quote, very serious, unquote, violations of numerous articles of the International Covenant of Civil Rights, along with appalling violations of the UN basic principles on the role of lawyers. They also made the point in a statement that the remedy for this requires the immediate release of Stephen Donziger and accord him with enforceable right to compensation and other reparations. The working group requested that the United States government ensure a full and independent investigation of the circumstances surrounding the case and engage in specified follow-up procedures. None of those things took place. None of those things took place at all. And Donziger, who knew that the case was coming up at this point, made a statement. And guys, I'm going to ask you to pull Donziger's statement. I know I didn't ask for it before, but I'm going to ask for it now. And I also want to pull up Palace's statement behind that one. But basically, he makes a statement knowing that he's going to the place where danger awaits him. And he was just so happen to be right. Let's play that clip.
Hey everybody, it's that time. Tomorrow I'm being sentenced after being in house arrest for 2 years and 2 months, unlike any other lawyer in American history. I'm not going to lie, it's a tough night for me and my family. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know if when I walk into the courthouse in the morning I'm going to be walking out after the sentencing hearing. I think I will be, but I'm not 100% sure. But I want to say this, we built tremendous momentum. This week the United Nations ruled with a ruling of 5 international jurists that my entire detention is arbitrary and illegal, and they ordered the U.S. government to release me and to pay me compensation. Now, I don't know if Judge Preska is going to pay attention to that decision or not. I think there's other reasons she should release me, that I've now served 8 times the longest sentence ever given a lawyer for my offense. But we're feeling good going in. We have a lot of momentum. If things don't work out tomorrow and Judge Preska remands me to jail, you're not going to be hearing from me for a while. It might be a day or two until the appellate court steps in, or it could be months until I serve my entire sentence. I have no way of knowing. So if you do not hear from me, know that behind closed doors, I will be thinking of you, thinking of all of the support, thinking of our movement, and knowing that hopefully when I get out, we'll be able to pick up this work even stronger than we are now. I'm going to need people to pay attention to our elected representatives, to call out Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Merrick Garland, my elected representatives, Jerry Nadler, Chuck Schumer, Kirsten Gillibrand. They need to pay attention. They need to be forced to pay attention to this human rights violation. So just understand how appreciative I am of all the support and the love and the messages. We're going in tomorrow hopeful, respectful, and hoping that Judge Preska will do the right thing and release me for time served, given the extraordinary length of time I've been in my home. Thank you very much, and hopefully you'll be hearing from me after sentencing tomorrow.
All throughout this case, it has been utterly and entirely astonishing that it's been allowed to get this far. Federal prosecutors have refused to bring contempt charges against Donziger, and an extraordinary abuse of this is WSWS. In an extraordinary abuse of legal process, U.S. District Judge Lewis Kaplan, who had investments and funds and withholding in Chevron, deputized a private law firm to pursue him for contempt of court. Utterly astonishing, and again, has never happened before. This is Greg Palast. Greg Palast is a reporter. Oftentimes, I'm doing election coverage or voting coverage or election laws. Basically, Republicans undermining the ability for people to vote. In this case, he was reporting on the Donziger trial. Let's play the clip.
Stephen Donziger, human rights lawyer, has just been sentenced to 6 months in prison. Donziger is the lawyer who successfully brought a $9.5 billion lawsuit against Chevron Corporation, where they were found guilty of poisoning the natives of the Amazon in Ecuador and destroying the rainforest. Chevron's never paid, but Donziger's now paying, with 6 months in prison for supposed contempt of court. He was prosecuted for the first time in U.S. history, not by the U.S. Justice Department, but by a private attorney who worked for Chevron, the first corporate prosecution in America sending a man to prison. No jury trial. Stephen Donziger, human rights lawyer, 6 months in prison. This is Greg Palast reporting from in front of federal court, Manhattan, New York.
This is very disturbing. And if you think about it, the notion that corporations, once losing a case of, let's say, dumping or some kind of other environmental devastation, can basically come back to the home country of the person who basically won that case and go after them punitively using the legal system to do so. That is a chilling, chilling new reality. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm typically joined with my co-host Shane. He's not necessarily here today. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you'd like to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So last Monday, they were supposed to have the vote on the bipartisan bill. Now, this is $550 billion on additional spending. And this was a deal negotiated between Democrats and Republicans. The deal has already passed the Senate. The catch is the deal needed to pass the House. Problem: this deal was intrinsically linked to the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package. Well, it seemed that the reconciliation package stalled because despite the overwhelming majority of Democrats backing it, two in the Senate weren't on board for it and couldn't even explain why they weren't necessarily on board for it. And so progressives that have told them over the course of the last 4 months, it's all or nothing. Either both go through or neither goes through. And for the first time in a very, 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 very long time, the political equivalent of a battered wife, the lefties, hold their ground. And the Congressional Progressive Caucus was going to kill that bill. The bill gets pushed from last Monday to Thursday, and then pushed from Thursday to Friday. And then on Friday, when it became very clear that Pelosi didn't have the votes to get that bill over the finish line, because again, Sinema and Manchin were basically going to kill the reconciliation bill and weren't going to back that bill. Well, at that point, Pelosi couldn't get it over the finish line. Joe Biden's agenda, Build Back Better, is now on life support with unclarity on when and if it is going to get passed. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, thank you for joining me.
Of course, Jamal, anytime.
Absolutely. So what are your thoughts on this? I mean, on Friday, they kept kicking the can down the road. It was supposed to be on Monday. Then it was supposed to be on Thursday. Then it was supposed to be on Friday. And on Friday, it became clear they just don't have the votes. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, and this is not, some people might think of, oh, it's just the squad. No. This is not just the squad. The Congressional Progressive Caucus has around 100 members. And Jayapal has been very clear that more than half of those members will kill this bill if they're not willing to basically have good faith negotiations and pass the reconciliation bill. What are your thoughts here so far? I mean, this bill is basically on life support at this point.
Yeah, well, we have a combination of bad faith and bad decisions coming together to create a crisis inside the Democratic Party. And the bad faith is Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who clearly have some number in mind that they're willing to support on the what they're calling the human infrastructure bill, the social spending bill, but they're not willing to share it with the rest of us. So it's like not. How about this much lower? Not low enough. How about this much lower? Not low enough.
Well, Manchin did at least say $1.5 trillion. Sinema has been basically off the reservation, has been spending so much time with her donors that she hasn't given any kind of number that she'd be willing to even negotiate around.
Right. And look, obviously the 1.5 is so far into the basement. If you were at a flea market and something was for sale for $3, you probably would not offer $1.50 without expecting a sneer and not to cut a deal. So it's not even close enough to discuss. There's also there's the bad decision making. We talked about this earlier about the splitting up of the two bills in the first place, which was not the way this was originally envisioned. It was originally one giant package. Spinning it off into a reconciliation bill and a non-reconciliation bill was bound to lead to exactly what we have now. And then I was also thinking about, a president who was very successful at passing a wide array of sweeping social welfare legislation in a short time, FDR. And I was thinking one of the things he did is he split each program into individual pieces of legislation. And that had a lot of positive effects, not least of which that, even 100 years later, we point to that and say, look at all the stuff he got done. Even if everything had gone perfectly and both of these bills had passed, in the end, by the midterm elections next year, these will probably be the last major legislative achievements of the Biden administration. And they're only going to be able to say, look at these two big bills we passed, and the Republicans will say, look at these two expensive bills that got passed. Whereas if there had been a whole long laundry list of individual bills that had been, for example, child care bill being an individual discrete bill, I think it would have been a more impressive thing to run on. And, so I think it's like there's been a lot of tactical errors here. And I'm not surprised we are where we are. but it's hard to see where they go from here. I suspect what we're going to end up with is just a very watered down social welfare spending bill.
Well, if Owen, to back up your point for a bit, at the very least, he would have been able to, let's say, give naming to each bill. Meaning, like, this is the bill to lower the age for Medicare and to expand Medicare to include dental and vision. Well, that's something that the overwhelming majority of the public agrees with. Even Republicans agree with it. And having that as, this is the name of this. This is the kind of what this particular bill is. Well, everybody's clear on what that is. And if you're against that, that looks pretty bad that you're against that, again, even for Republicans. And he could have went down the list for each and every item on that bill, because Biden himself would say, well, the bill is popular, especially when you ask people the individual elements. But that kind of, doesn't that hit the issue that you basically mentioned with the bipartisan and reconciliation? Wouldn't that be further cutting the bill into multiple parts, making it that much more likely that one of those parts were going to get undermined or subverted in some way?
Well, that's going to happen anyway, right? With the way things went. I mean, look, we weren't going to get all of it, no matter what. But I think, to your point, the parts that were popular are probably the parts that we need most. And those are the parts that should have been enumerated. Politics is 99% about framing.
Yeah.
And it just seems like Democrats don't know how to frame things anymore. I mean, even most well-informed voters don't really know what's inside these two pieces of legislation. It all seems very vague. People are reading the headlines on social media. They're not really doing the deep dive. So people don't really know what they're going to potentially win or what they're going to potentially lose.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Let's play this clip of Joe Biden because, I mean, look, the president, I've made the point on multiple occasions that this is not just a bill for lefties. Like, this is not a situation where the squad and their 8 members have all of this political force in order to bend Biden in the form and bend the moderates in the form. No, the moderates have no issue with marginalizing elements of the left. They've done it for 40 years. There's no reason that it would be any different today. The difference here is that Pelosi is looking at this as part of her legacy, and Biden is looking at this as part of his legacy. Not to mention these kind of, the way that Biden talks about we're competing against China and everything else. In his mind, this bill is somewhat transformative at what he considers to be an inflection point and is the way that the United States competes. That's your Biden. Because if all of that is true, what I just said, which I think it is, then he should have been far more instrumental and far more engaged in trying to get this thing over the finish line as opposed to being dejected in the way that it has been. Let's play the clip.
Biden's going to work like hell to make sure we get both these passed. And I think we will get them passed. And I'll be on the phone with them a lot and maybe meeting with some. And I'm going to be going around the country this week making the case why it's so important. Look, it's understandable. There's an awful lot that's in both of these bills that everybody thinks they know, but they don't know what's in them. When you go out and you test each of the individual elements in the bill, everyone is for them. Not everyone. Over 70% of the American people are for them. I believe I can get this done. I believe when the American people are aware what's in it, we can get it done. There is no reason why both these bills couldn't pass independently, except that they're not the votes to do it that way. It's a simple proposition. And so I think it makes sense. I support both of them, and I think we can get them both done. Well, I hope the Republicans won't be so irresponsible as to refuse to raise the debt limit and to filibuster the debt limit. That would be totally unconscionable. Never been done before. And so I hope that won't happen.
That statement is bizarre on a few points. He makes the point that says Biden is going to work like hell, call himself in the third person to get this done. Okay, fair enough. Doesn't seem like you were doing that up to this point, but fair enough. And then he says people don't know what's in the bill. And again, it's like, but dude, this is your economic agenda. Isn't it on some level, doesn't the buck stop at you to not just bring those members in to browbeat, carrot, stick, whatever you need to do to get it done, but also to basically go on this kind of presidential mission of explaining what your economic agenda is and why that economic agenda is important. Ted.
If only there was someone whose job it was to the American. I don't know what that job would be called. It's weird. The great communicator he ain't. And even I understand that he's not really the president. I know it's like the people, the old Obama people who are really, making all the decisions.
Yeah.
working like 3 hours a day. But they're not doing a good job either. I mean, I watch 3 major cable news networks every single day. I should be seeing a lot of ads from the DNC and from PACs explaining exactly what is inside this bill, and urging people to call their congressman and call their senator to urge passage of this bill. I'm not seeing that. There's none of this kind of concerted campaign. This all seems to be something that's happening in the Beltway ether, and away from the rest of us. And where I guess we're just going to sit outside, like in the hall, as they negotiated the Treaty of Versailles, all of mirrors. We'll hope it works out well.
But it's very weird. I mean, let me ask you this. Do you think that this is being considered his agenda? I mean, not agenda, his legacy. And the same thing for Pelosi. I mean, Pelosi, there was a lot of pushback on Pelosi getting the Speaker of the House this time around. And in her mind, this may not necessarily be something going forward. I mean, we don't even know if they're going to be able to hold on to the House and the Senate, considering, especially if they can't get this particular agenda accomplished. If both of these guys consider it their legacy, why not more impetus, or why not more emphasis on trying to get these things accomplished? And for that matter, why not more emphasis on going after the people that are basically holding up his agenda? It's only 2. It's not like you're going after 20 people. It's like 2 people that you need to either carrot or stick into backing your agenda. What is missing here? Does he just not have it in him to do this?
Well, I hope it's not his agenda. I mean, he was elected. He took the oath of office just over 8 months ago, and we elected him for a 4-year term. So if he's literally out there telling us, this is my agenda, I'm hoping you get it done next week. And, I guess I'm just going to be twiddling my thumbs for the next 3 years, or hoping to get Kamala Harris, elected. I mean, it's bizarre. It could. I mean, I don't think it's his agenda, or in reality, from historical terms, which is always what I'm looking at. I think what this really is teeing up for the midterms and hoping to stem the bleeding, or maybe even pick up a few seats. That's what this bill is really about. It's about having something to point to, and not to mention stimulating the economy in a major way, in order to keep things rolling through next year. I don't think, if we're talking about this was his agenda as he's leaving office or running for re-election 3 years from now, then there is no agenda. I know that FDR got much of his stuff done in the first 100 days, but, the FDR administration, had a lot more to do for 4 terms.
Well, yes, he had a lot more to do in 4 terms. But the legacy issue, I mean, so I agree with you that from the standpoint of the midterms, they're considering this is what we need. I mean, because if you think about it, it's not like Biden has got a lot accomplished. I mean, basically, it seems that everything was going to rise and fall on either the reconciliation and the bipartisan compromise. Okay, so fair enough. But that brings that much more emphasis to this. I mean, many of the moderates that are in these kind of battleground states, many of the lefties, all of these guys are looking at this as their way to maintain the House. And I believe Schumer definitely looks at this as their way of maintaining the House and the Senate going forward. Well, what are they missing here? Meaning the pressure that needs to be put on Sinema and Manchin is not just by, let's say, lefties, or not just from various people and, these constituents that want this provision. It's also by members of Congress that are basically going to lose their seats if they can't get it accomplished because of Sinema and Manchin. That seems to be that much more ire against these guys and that much more emphasis on trying to get these guys to fall in line. It's just weird to me that there's not more pressure on Manchin and Sinema on this issue, considering that they're about to take down the entirety of the party and their president's agenda.
Well, I think, it's a political party, but it's not really a band of brothers and sisters. And I think that's kind of the problem is, in recent and for a considerable history of this party, we've seen people just sort of crumpled up like napkins when, especially with the Democratic Party, when they're used up. So let's just say Manchin loses his seat because the voters of West Virginia are too conservative and don't go along after he decides to support the president's agenda. Is there a soft landing for Joe Manchin? Well, that's up to Joe Manchin and, maybe his Hollywood agent to hope that he ends up as a speaking gig with a speaking gig on CNN or MSNBC or maybe Fox. But it's up to him. This is not the way Republicans do things. If they needed 1 or 2 of theirs to take the fall, they would make sure that the person had a soft landing, at Pepperdine University, or, they would say, okay, don't worry, next time there's, we'll tee you up for Secretary of Treasury, next time we get in. There's a whole list. They have you're taken care of. That's just not, I think the problem here is there's too many disparate individual motivations, and everybody knows that in the end, it's up to, whether they survive or not is really just based on their voters and their donors. And it's not going to have, so the DNC doesn't have that clout to sort of, run it like a mob, like a mafia, team, and say, okay, listen, don't worry, we've got you. You to take this fall this time.
But that's the rub. I mean, when they were looking at the polling on the 3.5 trillion on the Biden's thing, I think in West Virginia, it was like 48% approve of the plan. The moment that you tell people, well, we're going to raise taxes on corporate and the rich in order to pay for it, that number jumped to like 70%. I mean, and for Sinema's standpoint, Sinema, let me ask you this. Do you think Sinema is miscalculating here? And the reason I say this is whatever she thinks her political ambitions are going to be, and whether she thinks those political ambitions are going to be served with this kind of, oh, I don't want to raise taxes. I'm not going to back the party. I'm not going to back the president. I'm going to leave these other members to basically, in the lurch where they are going to potentially lose their seats, especially if what she's doing ends up losing Democrats the House and the Senate. I mean, the notion of being a lobbyist after getting out of Congress when you've basically shirked your party in this way, this is kind of fanciful, right? Or am I wrong on this?
You're not wrong. I think Manchin is probably being a little smarter than Sinema is. And also, let's not forget the demographics. I mean, we think historically of Arizona as the state of Barry Goldwater, but it's really a purple state now. It has, the demographics are shifting, continuing to shift, have shifted. It's effectively a swing state. And for her to she has effectively broadcast that she isn't really a Democrat. She just happens to play one on TV. I don't think that works well. It leaves her kind of homeless. I don't see the Republicans taking her in. So where does she go? I think she could easily get primaried. Easily.
Well, there's an effort out to primary her now as we speak. And they were even going with this notion of trying to censure her for her behavior basically in Congress. So assuming she's, let's say, a rational actor, what is she thinking? Like, even if she's wrong in whatever she's thinking, what's the thought? What is the thing that she's clinging onto with grim death? Is it just the thought, 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash? I just need to get more cash, and I'm going to get that cash when they see me basically kill the president's agenda. What's in her mind on this, if possible? And I know you don't know that as a flat fact. I'm just curious from your, history of watching this stuff and watching these guys act.
Honestly, I'm wondering just like you. I don't think what's on her mind happens to be reflective of reality. She seems to be operating in an alternative reality. I'm guessing that she thinks her state is more conservative than it really is, and that she's going to be viewed as a hero within the party, sort of a Michelle Bachmann for the Democratic Party. Just the angry, sassy, loud, mean girl who derails evil, as Trump's spokesman recently called them, the communist Democrats, best laid plans. And then she'll be celebrated and invited to all the right country clubs. I'm guessing. I would be like, give it up. It's not going to happen that way.
How far do you think they're going to go with this? I mean, are these two really going to be in opposition to the party all the way through, so much so where they're willing to kill their own president's agenda and sink their party's hopes of retaining the House and the Senate? Like, I'm very curious about this because it doesn't seem like the lefties have any leeway to back away. I mean, after spending 3 months or 4 months saying, we're going to kill it, we're going to kill it, we're going to kill it, these things are together. And you have the president's backing, you have the leadership of the House, the leadership of the Senate. There doesn't seem to be this huge impetus for them to kind of back away from the cliff on this, especially when there's only 2 Democrats that seem to be in opposition. Are these 2 Democrats willing to take it all down?
I think, first of all, I agree with you. The progressives cannot back down at this point. They've gone too far. I'm not sure it's the battle I would have picked if I were them, but they did pick it, and so they're with it. My short answer is Manchin will not go to the mat and kill it. The Sinema might.
Wow. Wow, that is profound. If she does that, her time in Congress is basically over. I hope she knows that. And any notion of getting a job after Congress and everything else, wow, that is astonishing. What do you think the progressives will be willing to accept, though? Let's say for the moment, because you know what's going to happen. There's going to be all sorts of pressure. Mama Bear Pelosi is going to say, look, guys, we need you to fall in line. We need you to fall in line. We can't take down Biden's agenda. And even though I agree with you that I don't think they can back away at all from the standpoint of we need to get something, it's all or nothing, meaning the reconciliation has to pass for them to be able to support the bipartisan bill. What would they accept? And I guess that's the other question. $1.5 trillion is clearly too low. And one of them kind of made the point before, look, even if we accept a lesser number, you still have to attend to the priorities that were in the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, meaning there's only so low that they can go in order to attend to those particular priorities.
That's right. I know this is going to sound really silly in a way, but I think if it's anything less than splitting the difference, if it's the magic number in my mind from having watched this sort of thing before, here is 2.5. They cannot go. The progressives cannot abide 2.49. They've got to see 2.5 or better. Otherwise, I don't think they can go along. They're just going to look like they got rolled.
Yeah.
They need to. It has to look like they got at least halfway in between these two positions.
Let's hear Sanders for the moment. This was Sanders on Sunday. Everybody was making the rounds. Strong words from everybody, of course. Let's hear Bernie.
The pharmaceutical industry has 1,400 lobbyists on Capitol Hill right now trying to stop us. We're not just taking on or dealing with Senators Manchin or Senator Sinema. We're taking on the entire ruling class of this country. Right now, the drug companies, the health insurance companies, the fossil fuel industry are spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to prevent us from doing what the American people want. And this really is a test of whether or not American democracy can work. The Republican Party is bought and paid for by the pharmaceutical industry. They're not going to do anything. But I hope very much, and I expect, that the Democratic caucus and the president, I know he will, stand firm and tell the drug companies, stop ripping us off. Well, tell the insurance companies that the American people need. The elderly people need dental care, hearing aids, and eyeglasses. People need home health care. Our young people need the quality child care that they deserve. That's what this struggle is about. Do we do what the American people want? Do we fulfill what democracy is supposed to be about? Or do we bow down to powerful special interests?
Bernie Sanders is still fighting. Think about that. Putting Medicare for all on the map, first of all, losing 2 presidential elections, but still getting stuff out of the fact after the loss. Meaning this time around, getting the budgeting, head of the budgeting committee. And in this very specific case, he's the one that pushed that number up to, I believe it was like $6 trillion at one point when he first came out. And then the number got pushed down to $3.5 trillion, which is still somewhat of a significant figure. And in this case, he's making that very clear point that, look, these guys are bought and sold. Do you think that Sinema, that part of the calculus for this is, well, from the drug company standpoint, they know that any plan that goes forward from the reconciliation is going to include potentially Medicare being expanded, for one, the age limit being lowered, for one, and also this idea of having Medicare to be able to negotiate drug costs. And so for them, anything that passes is a red line, in which case pushing Sinema, or for that matter, Manchin, I believe Sinema got nearly like $1 million from these guys, basically to kill it. Meaning the only thing or the only position she could ever take if she's being pushed by these people is basically kill it all, because they're not going to get what they want out of it, which is basically to not have the drug negotiation, or for that matter, to not have the expansion of Medicare.
Well, first of all, Bernie Sanders lost the elections, but he won the war of ideas.
Yes.
Moved the entire party to the left, and he had the big ideas that really resonated with the American people, and he did know how to frame them for the most part. He's clearly, look, Big Pharma knows that this is a battle that they are going to lose to some extent. They're just trying to mitigate the losses. And so they're fighting tooth and nail. And for them, victory is just losing as little as possible. But they are going to, those profits are going to get nibbled into. I suspect something is going to get done, probably. But, all roads lead to Phoenix, but we shall see what happens there. But it's, I do think in the end, the pressure on cinema will just be too great. And, frankly, $1 million in donations sounds like a lot of money, but it's also the value of a medium-sized price in a lot of house in a lot of American cities. So I think the DNC can probably find another way to, make her happy, right?
Yeah, juice her pockets.
It's, so it's, I think it's going to get done. God, I love listening to Bernie. It just makes me think, God, that guy could have been president.
Yeah, true believer, right? Because I don't have this feeling that, look, I don't have this feeling that if Sanders was president, that he would have to come out and say, people don't know what's in this bill. I don't get that feeling at all. Nor do I get this feeling that either Sinema or Manchin wouldn't have a lot of people at their door screaming at them to pass this bill. I think there will be all sorts of pressure where he will be used in this kind of inside-outside game, whereas Biden just seems to be completely dejected and incapable of putting up this kind of push for his own agenda. It's unfortunate, to put it mildly, but like you said, this guy could have been president. Like, I wanted it. Let me do this. We have a caller from New York City that had a question on the budget reconciliation. So let's go to David from New York. David?
Yes, I'm here. My first time calling in. I enjoyed the show many times.
Thank you, man. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. The question or comment I have, I guess, is why doesn't the Democratic National Committee or the Squad or some combination of that, since Joe Biden's not pushing the bill to the public, why don't they spend money, take out advertisements, especially in West Virginia and Arizona, explaining what's in the bill so that people can understand what their representatives are actually doing? And in fact, even national. This is a time when the message has to get out. You mentioned that most people don't even know what's in the bill. Well, that's true. I don't really know exactly what's in the bill. I heard a little bits from you on the show, but why doesn't that get spend some money? Take TV advertisements, social media advertisements, all national. Make it a big deal. This is a time for that. That's my suggestion. What do you think?
Thank you, David. Ted. Good point, right? I mean, why don't they start to spend some cheddar, try to go after Sinema and Manchin, especially considering, again, their ability to hold on to the Senate and the House is intrinsically linked to their ability to get things accomplished and get things accomplished in a way where people can fill in their pockets. And so why don't either DNC, why don't either the Squad or members of the Squad, or for that matter, Biden himself, backed by the Democratic Party, take those provocative actions?
I don't know if the Squad has the kind of, pack muscle to do that, but certainly the DNC does, and certainly the party overall could do it, and there's lots of, PAC money floating around. I suspect, and this is pure speculation, that the tactics that's being undertaken by the administration and by Pelosi and Schumer is to say, look, let's play nice. We're not going to go to war and, play and go to West Virginia and Arizona into these two guys' backyard in order to mess with them and make them feel like they're being undermined and being, attacked from being stabbed in the back by their own party. We're going to try to convince them. We're going to control them. We're going to bribe them, but we're not going to, we're going to use more carrot than stick. I think that they've decided on that strategy, and this reflects that.
Yeah, but they don't do that with lefties. This is the thing, I guess, that always aggravates me. I mean, do you remember when, I believe it was Steny Hoyer, this was a few years ago, The Intercept ran this, where the guy recorded Steny Hoyer basically telling them to get out the race and that the Democratic Party has already chosen who they want to run in that particular district. And, Pelosi was backing this. All of these guys were backing this. They had zero issue at all going after, let's say, certain lefties or putting up certain candidates to run against those lefties. I mean, even going so far as to have, I believe it was the DSCC and the DCCC to basically blacklist any lefty that is running against, let's say, another candidate. But they completely ignored that policy when you had Kennedy running against Markley. And so it's very aggravating to me. It's if they want their president's agenda to get accomplished, this kind of in-beltway game doesn't necessarily seem to be working at this point. So, but Ted, I agree with you. I mean, just self-evident at this point. Ted, 80, before we close, is there anything else you want to kind of mention on this, or any kind of thoughts that you have on either how this is going to turn out or what this next week we should expect in this coming week?
I'm going to give it 60-40 that we're going to end up with a bill that's right at $2.5 trillion, and that this will get done because it's in the general interest of all concerned for it to get done, including cinema. And she needs to be made to see that. I do think it'll probably get done, but I'm allowing myself a lot of wiggle room to say it could easily all fall apart. If so, that will be really catastrophic for the Democrats going into the midterms.
And if it all, yeah, right there. Okay. I was going to say, if it all falls apart, then what? Well, at that point, just catastrophe. Because again, it wasn't like Biden has gotten a ton accomplished within the context of this particular administration. And yeah, for all of the promises that he basically ran and got elected on, well, at this point, it's somewhat lacking. I mean, even stuff that he had power to do, like the elimination of student loans or the legalizing of pot. And not legalizing, but at the very least taking this, changing the scheduling of it. Joe Biden made plenty of promises, and he seemed to be somewhat lacking on those promises. Ted, thank you, man. I really appreciate it. I always enjoy these conversations.
Thank you.
The voice that you guys were listening to is Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles at raw.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm typically here with my co-host. He's not here today. He's not necessarily feeling that well. But this is going to be an open segment. And first, call on the line, Tarif from New Orleans. What's going on, Tarif?
How you doing, Jamal? Good morning, man. First, I'd like to say free Julian Assange, free Danziger, and hands off Haiti. And we'll talk about Julian Assange, and also another comment. Julian Assange, as we all know, this stories has been coming out about how Mike Pompeo and other people in the CIA, is trying to go after him and stuff like that. So we got to constantly back up Julian Assange and make sure that he get freed. And hopefully when, the judge ruled this month, hopefully it's in his favor. If not, we got to keep on pushing to get this man free, because every journalist and whistleblower, no matter where they at on the planet, could be sisters to the United States and maybe one day Britain for telling the truth, which we can't let that happen. Freedom of speech is freedom of speech. So we got to support Julian Assange and everybody else that tells the truth. My second comment is dealing with Iran and Saudi Arabia supposed to be in talks.
Mm-hmm.
It's to work out the grievances, which is a good thing. And what that comes down to is that geopolitically move what took place last month, dealing with how the Taliban hurry up and took over them cities. And once Saudi Arabia saw that, they saw like the fingerprints of like China and Russia, So Eurasia, went to the east, and you got the SCO, which is that Shanghai Cooperation Organization,
mm-hmm.
in place with different countries in that region of the world joining that. And I think what Saudi Arabia is seeing with their 3 billion people, close to 4 billion people in that part of the world, they want to be part of that. They don't want to get left out that Belt and Road initiatives. The U.S. can only help them out so much, because you must realize the middle class is growing in China. That's more people that's going to need more cars. So that's more fuel that the Saudi Arabians can sell to China. So this is about dollars. Yes, it's about geopolitics, and we all know that Iran and Saudi Arabia don't get along. But when it comes down to money, people put the differences aside. So let's hopefully that Better Road Initiative can make it all the way through there, through Saudi Arabia, going through North Africa, and hopefully Europe and the United States is joining in the next 5 to 10 years. And, we can have a better world where we can have nuclear power plants, fusion plants, no more poverty, a world, not just United States single-payer program or Medicaid for all, but a Medicaid for all for everybody on the planet. You see what I'm saying? And that's what we should all work for. And that's why I'm pushing. So, yeah, that's all I want to say. Thank you, Jamal, for letting me speak.
That's a good dream, Tarif. And I can't say I disagree with you on that one. Medicare for all of the world. Look, man, if you think about the amount of money we spend just in the United States alone on we spend like $1 trillion a year on the military budget. That is an astonishing amount of money that we spend just to basically find ways to kill each other. And it's not just the United States by itself. I mean, you have, each and all of these countries basically spend a ton of cash on military. And of course, if you're spending that much money on military, it's going to take away from public spending or investment into public, into rail, into, these other things that just make life that much better. Tarif, can't say I disagree with you. Michael from Silver Springs. Michael, what's going on, man?
I just wanted to say that a couple of things. First, this coronavirus thing, putting politics aside, I'm wondering how much influence the pharmaceutical companies are going to have now, given the fact that they were proposed by the federal government to come up with a cure, and they held the destiny of the entire globe in their hands and their business enterprise. What type of influence are they going to have in the next 5 to 10 years? Secondly, the second thing I want to...
well, wait, before you go to the second one, let's answer the first one. What other entities come up with pharmaceuticals, or what other entities come up with dealing with disease? Meaning, for example, for Alzheimer's or multiple sclerosis or AIDS, what other edifice in our world comes up with things to deal with those things?
There's natural remedies. I mean,
natural remedies for AIDS and for multiple sclerosis and cancer?
The medicine, yes, the medicines that are derived, they come from natural plants.
Sometimes
they're natural at the beginning, so it's really just a matter of the recipe.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, do you believe that the natural remedies versus a current, let's say medical establishment, that the natural remedies were better? Meaning the ability to relieve pain, the ability to deal with various illnesses and everything else. You believe that the natural remedies were perfectly suited to our current modern day, and that those are better than basically the current medical establishment that we currently have.
I've heard that there are natural remedies to cure cancer, for example, like baking soda, but you have to take out some type of additive. I can't remember, from this guy called Dick Gregory. But I don't know for sure. I mean, I just say that it's in the best interest of these companies to patent, which is the whole purpose.
That is true. I guess what I'm getting at is, how's COVID different than what it's always been? Like, for example, if you break a leg.
Emergency.
If you break a leg, and you go to, I would ideally believe you go to the hospital, are you going to ask for white willow? Or are you going to ask for morphine?
My family asked for the natural. Never the drugs. Never.
So if you are in dramatic pain from either cancer, from breaking a leg, or some kind of serious injury, you're going to get white willow as opposed to having some kind of pain medication to deal with the pain that you're in.
Not me, but people outside of the city setting, urban, first world countries,
they don't have a choice. That's a difference.
They used the opium plant in Afghanistan. Mothers do. I saw it on a channel.
I know, but opium is still a narcotic, and this is kind of where I'm getting with the morphine and these other drugs. I mean, look, many of y'all don't know this, but I actually have a degree in holistic nutrition. It was my first degree. It was a bachelor's in holistic nutrition from this place called Clayton College of Natural Health. I went further and ended up getting the certificates in herbology and so forth. And at a certain point, when I realized this stuff is not necessarily bogus, but in contrast to either our current medical dilemmas that we deal with in regards to our understanding of the pharmacology and dealing with various illnesses and whatnot, it is woefully lacking. I'm telling you, if you're in a situation where you're in severe pain, whether it's nerve pain, whether it's some kind of other kind of neurological pain, or for that matter, whether it's some kind of major injury, you're not going to be asking for an herb. You're going to be asking for hard drugs. Do you disagree with that?
I think it's a case by case, and some people would rather die. Some people would rather die, and I don't think it's.
Is that a rational act to die from a broken leg as opposed to getting some kind of payments?
Well, pharmacology has only been around for.
Okay, we're losing you on this. I feel you, Michael. I'm just saying, I think most people left with the situation of getting some kind of medical treatment, of dealing with some kind of pharmacology to deal with pain and injury and everything else, or for that matter, infections, will choose the pharmacology. I was in a hospital, this was years ago, and I was in a situation where the virus that I had was no longer responding to the antibiotics that they were prescribing. And it's just so happened that they had this class of super antibiotics that had taken place over the course of, I don't know, maybe that year, what did work. But were it not for the drugs at the disposal, they would have basically had to cut out various areas of skin and cut out that particular area with hopes that you can heal and that they can get all of the infection out. I mean, I get that there are negative consequences to these drug companies and everything else. You don't get any disagreement on that. But the notion that you would basically say, I am willing to basically die as opposed to having this life-saving drug because I hate drug companies, I don't think that's a rational act, Michael. I'm just being honest. Can't say if he still hears us, if he's still there. But Michael, again, thank you for joining us. Well, Michael, you had 1 second comment. I don't know if Michael is still here. Is he still here? He's gone. Okay. Yeah, we were losing you towards the end of that, but there was a second comment. So definitely, if you get the opportunity and you could get the call back, feel free to call in to give us your second take. There's one other headline that I kind of want to get to that I thought was uber interesting. The whistleblower from Facebook who leaked thousands of internal Facebook documents to Wall Street Journal has identified herself as Frances Hagen. She stated to the media that Facebook, well, quote, Facebook over and over again has shown it chooses profits over safety. This comes after a scathing Wall Street Journal report showcasing the very harmful effects the company and other apps have on mental health. Now, let's be clear for the moment. Most companies have a bias towards cash. And in Facebook's case, everything that they are is social media, meaning your pictures, your photos, the things that you say and everything else. They've basically found a way to monetize those things. And it is somewhat naive to believe that Facebook is going to take a back seat and say, okay, we're going to lessen our profits. And instead of kind of going full-throated into making and maximizing our cash, that we're somehow going to undermine our current business model and lends itself towards mental health. I don't see that taking place either with Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. It's also a secondary thing that human beings put this stuff on social media, and they, of course, are going to try to put out their best foot forward. And in that situation, you're going to have some people that feel some way about themselves over the lives of others. I'm not quite sure how you get around that. I don't even know if you can have social media if you attend too much to that particular point. But look, this is Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We'll be back with our last hour. Back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left and only corner, I'm your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And that means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and an absent Stranahan. All right, really good show today. Very interesting conversations. And so let's do this. Let's get to our headlines, top of the hour, standard. Also, I'm going to give a shout out to Ted on the conversation for the issues of taking place in Congress. The intra-party fight has been phenomenal, or it'd just be uber fascinating. I mean, if you think about it, how often do you get a situation where basically Democrats are in lockstep in the House, lockstep in the Senate, with the exception of basically two members, and that those two members are basically willing to take down the entirety of the party's agenda? It is fascinating politics that are taking place. And it kind of leads to this question of carrot, stick. What powers does the president have, or for that matter, what powers does Congress have to kind of compel members to fall in line? And look, there are some situations where you would want your members to basically stand up for their constituents, to stand up for the American public. But it seems like the constituents that these guys are standing up for are basically their donors, considering the overwhelming majority of the public backs the items that are in these bills. We'll keep an eye on it. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, yesterday, in the United States, there were 25,833 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,878 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 106,941 cases per day. Still, a decrease from 28% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and now 65% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,654,161 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 701,326 men, women, and children in this country. Basically senseless deaths, considering we shouldn't be anywhere near that number if there was public policy, if people stuck by the notion of masks, and the vaccinations. But here we are. Also, one of the things to take note of is the 25,833 number. I continuously point this out because that number tends to be low coming off of the weekend. This seems to be a reporting issue and not necessarily a reality issue. The number tends to be higher, and it tends to basically increase as we get further and further into the week, whether traditional reporting methods take place. The 1,878 is pretty high for Monday, and I'm not sure how that bodes for the rest of the week. Thailand's government is in talks with the U.S. drug manufacturer Merck & Company for purchasing 20,000 of their experimental COVID antiviral pills. South Korea and Malaysia have also expressed interest in following suit. The United States has asked China to cease their aggressive actions over Taiwan as the world power flies their warplanes purposely over Taiwan's airspace. The flight paths are conducted in a corner of Taiwan's ADIZ zone, questioning the legitimacy of those restrictions. We had a great conversation with Carl Jha earlier this morning that basically made the point that the ADIZ zone is not over like Taipei, which is the capital of Taiwan, and that China basically doesn't accept this ADIZ zone and the lengths of the ADIZ zone that basically was unilaterally created by Taiwan. He admits it is on some level provocative, but it is not the same thing. It's basically a freedom of navigation exercise. But instead of the United States doing this in the South China Sea, China is basically doing this over this kind of regional territory. Stephen Donziger has been sentenced to 6 months in prison. Donziger successfully sued Chevron for $9.5 billion for their harmful practices in dumping in the Amazon. He has been unjustly locked under house arrest for over 2 years, serving 8 times the amount of time any previous person has served for this crime. After all, he still gets prison time. They basically held him for contempt of court because he wouldn't hand over his own, let's say, computers and his own information out of this kind of it's procedural, meaning it's information that's pertinent to the lawyer, attorney-client privilege, all sorts of things that this thing breaches. It was an atypical order. And in him trying to push back for an appeal on this order, they basically put the hammer down on him. He's getting 6 months. This case is astonishing, to put it mildly. In international news, millions of leaked documents have uncovered the truth about how current and former world leaders secure their finances. No country was exempt, with reports detailing the financial practices of leaders from Britain, Brazil, Ukraine, Ecuador, Russia, the United States, and many more. The files are being called the Pandora's Papers. One of the cases has even to do with Tony Blair, where apparently he's dodged, I believe it was over $500,000 or 500,000 pounds in taxes. Of course, Blair backs up his move as being perfectly legitimate, but many of these cases are disturbing, to put it mildly. And these guys basically avoiding paying their fair share to their home countries. Russia has successfully fired a hypersonic missile from a submarine. President Vladimir Putin has said the Zircon is capable of flying at 9 times the speed of sound, has a range of 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles for our American audience. U.S.-based scientists David Julius and Artem Pataputian won the Nobel Peace Prize today for their research into the discovery of receptors that allow human beings to feel temperatures and to feel touch. Congratulations on that front. A massive oil spill in California has spread crude oil through the water and onto the beaches of Orange County coast in California. Law enforcement is looking into the matter, but they believe the culprit is an oil platform and reservoir named Ellie, 4.5 miles off the coast. The reservoir could still be leaking as divers are trying to learn more about the causes. In business news, the whistleblower from Facebook who leaked thousands of internal Facebook documents to the Wall Street Journal has identified herself as Frances Hagen. She stated to the media that, quote, Facebook over and over again has shown it chooses profits over safety. This comes after a scathing Wall Street Journal report showcasing the very harmful effects of the company and other apps have on mental health. In holiday news, we have several holidays going on today. National Golf Lovers Day, which is funny. National Cinnamon Roll Day. World Animal Day. Early on, we had, I believe it was National Vodka Day, which was one of them, and National Taco Day. I often keep asking myself, people have way too much time on their hand in making these days, but nevertheless, here we are. Go play some golf, go get a cinnamon roll, and enjoy the day. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. That is funny. These quote-unquote days, and they just seem arbitrary and all over the place. Tarif gave a comment about the negotiations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And there's a question on why Saudi Arabia is making this tact towards being willing to have these communications. Now, part of this could have to do with the United States basically pulling out of Afghanistan and redirecting its focus towards an Asian pivot. And considering Iran is one of the major powers in the region, without their big bro, the United States, well, Saudi Arabia may have come to these kind of different assessment of the region and the things that they need to do to maintain their station. This is Reuters. Saudi Arabia confirmed on Sunday that it has held its first round of direct talks with Iran's new government last month, part of a process begun earlier this year to reduce tensions between the Gulf rival Sunni and Shiite Muslim powers. The longtime foes who severed ties in 2016 began talks in April at a time when Washington and Tehran were discussing reviving a nuclear pact that Riyadh and its allies had opposed. 3 rounds of Saudi-Iranian talks were held in Iraq in the months before Iran's new hardline president, Ibrahim Raisi, took office in August. If you remember correctly, at the point where the Yemen war was taking place, Saudi Arabia was against, and I know these things seem different, but they are related. The Obama administration was in talks with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wanted to basically attack Yemen. Obama, at the time, did not want Saudi Arabia to create any kind of headwind against his nuclear deal, the JCPOA, with Iran. And so in almost this, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, or I'll leave one issue if you leave the other, Obama comes back and basically green-lights the war on Yemen, which ended up being an environmental and a humanitarian catastrophe, with them using starvation and having these kind of arbitrary killings of civilians. In the case of the JCPOA, well, that extended up until the point where Trump basically killed the JCPOA, and Biden hasn't necessarily revived it despite having these kind of background talks on the issue. The reality is the United States was the one that basically pulled out of the JCPOA, and there should be a certain amount of political courage by the Biden administration to go back to the deal. If we're the ones that pulled out, then we're the ones that should go back to the deal. And you can make an argument that the reason why a hardliner was voted in office in the first place has everything to do with the JCPOA and everything to do with Trump's actions or the United States' actions after signing that deal. You basically had the moderates that were able to push back the hardliners in order to get them to sign the JCPOA with many of the provisions that seemed to go too far, but nevertheless, Iran believed that they were going to be able to get this kind of sanction relief and this kind of economic boon as a result of signing the deal. Well, what happens when the moderates sign a deal such as the JCPOA, and then the very next president that comes in office not just kills the deal, but ramps up all sorts of military pressure, sanctions, and everything else that makes your country have that much more, or putting your country in certain dire straits? For one, there is no propensity at all to go back to a deal like that. There is zero propensity to negotiate anything in lieu of that deal that you've basically gotten rid of. And of course, if the moderates were burned because they decided to make a deal with the United States that couldn't necessarily be trusted, well, the moderates are going to lose their seats. And that is basically what took place. Biden, honestly, should have went back to that deal as soon as he got in office. And the reality of it is that the United States wanted to save face. They didn't want to seem as if they were kind of running with their head in their hands. But the reality is there is no other method or provision that seems to be on the table that would allow, let's say, a certain degree of balance in regards to the conversation or regards to Iran and the U.S. relationship. It's unfortunate, but this is kind of where we are currently. There's another report. Boko Haram moves into north-central Nigeria in an apparent expansion. If you remember, Boko Haram is this group that basically steals kids, if I remember this correctly, if I'm associating this correctly, oftentimes taking kids in Nigeria. For whatever reason, the government seems incapable of protecting those kids. And every so often, you would have the kids being delivered back, but it's almost like this kind of ransom thing that takes place. This is the report. Boko Haram insurgents have taken over multiple communities in Nigeria's north-central Niger state, offering villagers money and incorporating them into their ranks to fight the government, a local government official and State's Information Commission told Reuters. That, of course, does not bode well for regional stability, nor does it bode well for the residents of Nigeria. And again, for whatever reason, the government seems incapable of defending its civilian population against this terrorist group. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back in a moment with Dr. Gene Ollinger. This should be a great, great conversation on many new advancements taking place regarding COVID. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host. Not joined with him today, but typically joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what I'm putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So in a headline today, we had this conversation about the drug Merck that is basically on, here we are, Thailand's government is in talks with the United States drug manufacturer Merck & Company for purchasing 200,000 of its experimental COVID-19 antiviral pills. South Korea and Malaysia have also shown interest and is willing to follow suit. Now, the drug that I heard was Pfizer's, and that was the one I know a little bit more about. Where Pfizer has started a study dealing with 2,660 adults living in the same household with someone who's symptomatic and has COVID. And the point of the study is to see whether or not the drug can prevent the other people in the household from catching COVID. To have a conversation about this and other issues pertaining to COVID and some of the latest research, we're joined with Dr. Gene Ollinger. He's a professor at Boston University, the principal science advisor for MRI Global Inc., and recipient of the NIH Director Award in 2015 for his efforts assisting with the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. He has also conducted and supervised in vitro and in vivo experiments in maximum biocontainment, focusing on high consequence pathogens and biodefense. Dr. Ollinger, thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Jamal. Thank you for having me on the show.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was a lot of research that came out recently about COVID on all sorts of issues, everything from drugs and everything, going into certain symptomology, even on the notion of natural immunity. And so I was hoping that we can get you on. And so I definitely appreciate you joining us. Let's talk about the COVID pills, starting off. This has been considered a breakthrough by some sources. And like I mentioned, Pfizer's study was looking for people basically who were in a household with other people, meaning they're basically in close contact with somebody with COVID. And they're giving the people who don't have COVID the drug. And they're trying to see whether or not the drug can basically protect the people in the household from getting COVID. Now, if the drug can protect people in a household where they're in close contact with somebody with COVID, the thought would be that in other conditions, the drug would have somewhat of a breakthrough effect or a significant effect at reducing the amount of COVID and the number of cases, just overall, if you could get that drug to other people. What's the latest research on this?
So it's one of the goals of antiviral development is to find drugs that actually protect those that are around you that are the uninfected from the infected individuals. And so this is a step forward. It's where we want to be with antiviral treatments. It's much easier to treat someone, at an early phase of disease or preventing it from actually becoming a disease. And of course, that reduces transmission. So the whole goal is to reduce the amount of virus that's even in a person that might have just recently been infected, and then they don't spread it as easily. So this is a big step forward. Both drugs that you've talked about, including the one from Merck, they're very exciting. There's a lot to do between now and the full authorization of them, but there's some good hope in these drugs.
When you say good hope in these drugs, so how does the drug actually work? And for the one for Merck, are both drugs basically the same, or is the one for Merck and Pfizer different in some way?
Very similar. The drug for Merck that's been reported this weekend, that basically is an analog. It's something we've been working with viruses for quite some time now, and this was developed for flu. It was a drug being developed for flu. It was kind of a long history of this drug, but it's basically causing errors in the ability for the virus to replicate itself. So it induces errors in the viral replication. So when it does that, the virus can't replicate as easily and, of course, can't have high titers of virus come out. So that's how it works. These are always very difficult because the ability to select a drug that's not affecting you, because remember, viruses use our host systems to actually make copies of themselves, so we want to make sure we don't have an impact on ourselves. So the selective index, we call it, the ability to have something that's not toxic but yet therapeutic is a very narrow window for these drugs. And so that's what they're looking at now is probably the toxicity of this.
Because basically the virus breaks into a cell and gets your cell, the machinery of your cell, to basically make copies of itself before exploding and basically infecting other cells. And so when you're trying to get something to go after it, it's basically just seeing you. And so the goal is to try to find something that could basically attack the virus without destroying the host. Is that right, first?
That's perfect. That's a perfect way of explaining it. And of course, whenever you affect the human host systems, you can affect other things and have side effects. And that's the concern that these drugs have had for some time, both the GSK drug that was used early in the year, this drug, and of course the Pfizer drugs.
Is there any concern that in creating errors on, let's say, the viral replication, that it would create a mutation?
That is a big concern. So the concern with all of these drugs is that if they're not adhered to, just like antibiotics, if you don't take them properly, and you could have virus mutants arise from this. So this is a 2-day drug. It's 2 times a day, and it's dosed for 5 days. So that's quite a bit of, that's a requirement of compliance on a patient to take these on a regular basis. And so that's always an issue clinically. And so that's the big concern there. And of course, there's this whole idea that, well, maybe patients will want to take this versus a vaccine, but there's a general tendency not to want to take anything against COVID at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, does the Pfizer drug work the same way, basically creating errors in the replication of the virus?
Several drugs. Both companies have multiple drugs that are in the pipelines, but that's generally the approach it's taking. Mm-hmm.
And this has nothing to do with ivermectin, right? I mean, you have a lot of people out there who've been putting out the conspiracy theory that these guys made an ivermectin drug. This has nothing to do with ivermectin.
Nothing to do with that. These are all drugs that are targeting a certain pathway that's called replication of the virus, and it's a very delicate system. You have to be careful with it. We've been looking at these drugs for more than 20 years and trying to find those that don't impact the host and cause toxicity and those that can actually have a beneficial effect. And it's just a very delicate group of compounds. Unfortunately, I'm kind of one of the people responsible for some of these drugs that were kind of put out there as possibilities, because we publish these as kind of, hey, this is a discovery, but discovery to actually use is very rare that we find something that works from discovery phase all the way to the point of actually using it in a human. And we can't publish those results. So a lot of times the animal studies that we do that don't work, or the further studies that we do with the drug don't work, nobody wants to publish that. So we're caught in this bind where people don't see the negative data.
How did they find this, by the way? I mean, like you said, it's somewhat of a rare process to be able to find something discovery all the way to the point where they can deploy it in the wild. How did they stumble across this?
Yeah, so typically these are done through what they call high-throughput drug screens, and what you do is set up an in vitro drug screen. It's either phenotypic or there's sometimes target-based systems you can develop and just basically look for reduction in a production of the virus. You can look for a reduction in a cytopathic effect in the cells. So there's a variety of ways doing this, and you just look at thousands upon thousands of drugs, and you find compounds that have similar structures and then work that structure out.
I see. So basically it's just testing, and moving on. And eventually you find something that's, hey, there's a potential for this, and you kind of expand upon the testing of the compound.
Yeah, it's gold mining in the old days. You're panning for, you have millions of drugs you can look at, and you pan for them and see which ones work the best.
Very interesting. One of the other issues came out had to do, by the way, do you consider this somewhat of a game changer? Meaning, if this actually does go through, and if this does work in the way they say it works, do you think that this is something, because it seems that up to this point, there's been so many variants associated with COVID that, you have people who are not wearing the mask, who are not getting vaccinated, who are not doing the social distancing. And, these things have basically created a propagation of the virus over the course of years, when really, I get the feeling that the virus shouldn't have been as prolific as it has been, and at the very least, definitely not to the point of over 700,000 dead Americans. But if this comes out where it is something that is effective and that doesn't necessarily harm the host, would this be somewhat of a game changer? Could this be the thing that basically says, okay, we're seeing the end point of COVID at this point with the creation of this particular product?
It's very encouraging to see a drug that's had that type of effect in outpatient populations, because that really changes the ability to manage patients in the hospital setting. I still think the resistance to drugs that are, that the government is a proponent of, and, just like the vaccine. And then remember, drugs typically have way more side effects than vaccines. Vaccines are typically not, the risk benefit for vaccines is the benefit's pretty high and the risk is pretty low. Drugs like this will have a higher risk and, of course, same benefit effect. So there's a big difference between these two, and whether or not the public will take this as a drug to stop the virus will be a big question.
I see. It basically, I see. The vaccine basically has far less potential consequences than the drug itself, even though both work. And, with people complaining about the vaccine, they're probably also going to complain about the fact that the drug exists. Very unfortunate.
Individuals, this could be a big step forward for them. For pregnancies and for children, these are drugs that will take a long time to get approval for that step.
Speaking of the pregnancy thing, one of the other latest research, they were showing that pregnant moms had traces of the mRNA protection in their system of the baby when they had the kid.
So this is a study with a pregnancy and mRNA?
Yeah, and they were recommending that pregnant women basically get vaccinated, with the hope being that the baby would be protected from the vaccination of the mother.
Yes. So typically, the mother shares her immunity with with the fetus, and of course the child when it's born through breast milk, and that's a very common way we protect children from whatever the circulating organisms that are causing disease at that time. So that's a very common effect, and it's really a no-brainer. Yes, it does happen, and the studies needed to be done to show that it was working. So,
is there any concern at all with the mRNA vaccine and the infant or the baby at all? Like, I guess what I'm asking, and somewhat of a weird question, but I guess I'm asking, is there any, let's say, concern that the mRNA vaccine would have any kind of adverse effect on the child?
Not at the moment. I mean, the studies so far with pregnancy and even with pregnant women with the vaccine, there's not been any indication that there's something to be worried about. Again, the messenger RNA is much like the messenger RNA that our bodies are producing at high levels every day to actually make the proteins that keep us alive every day. So it's just one more that's being added in, and it doesn't last that long. It essentially makes its proteins and slowly disappears over time. So it's recycled into our normal systems at that point.
I see. And there was this kind of, I guess I want to call it conspiracy theory, that the mRNA somehow breaks into the nucleus of the cell. I'm not sure if you've heard about this one, but that's not true, right? I mean, basically, it goes in, it makes the material, and eventually fades away.
Exactly. So, I mean, you're making millions and millions of mRNAs in every cell every day just to make the proteins and to keep your life going. And so this is just one more that gets in. It's just like the virus itself. The virus does the same thing. It makes messenger RNA, and that messenger RNA gets made into proteins. And so it's the same process, and we're just hijacking it both from a host side and from the virus side to say, hey, look, this is the virus protein. I'll make a response against it.
Interesting.
It doesn't last very long.
Very interesting. So one of the other issues that came up that I looked at, once I saw this, I was like, oh, wow. I mean, that gets that much more impetus for getting the vaccination in order to just prevent it. Meaning, because some people have made this argument that, oh, I'll just get COVID, my chances of death aren't that high. And it's like, that is insane. Getting COVID is not necessarily a hedge against getting COVID or protection from COVID. One of the issues that came up was organ damage. They were finding that there was a higher propensity for organ damage of people who ended up with COVID, especially people who had long-term COVID. Do they know what causes the long-term COVID issue? Have they been able to find any kind of link or any kind of rationale for how COVID creates this kind of long-term issue? And for that matter, why this stuff leads to organ damage in some cases?
There's a whole area of research into acute infectious diseases that ranges from everything from Ebola to common colds to measles, and we know that these infections that we get don't just lead to the acute infection and you're better. There's often unrecognized and then, of course, recognized clinical sequelae is what it's called, and long-term clinical consequences. So, for example, measles can delete certain immunity that we have in the past. It'll actually delete it from our immune repertoire, the ability to respond to pathogens. So it has that ability. You don't even know that until you go get infected with another virus.
Wait. It can delete your immune system's ability to respond to pathogens that your body has basically encountered in the past?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of research looking into that and how that happens. And then for Ebola, we know that, for example, there's cognitive loss that's been reported. There's hearing loss in acute infections that has, in some cases, been replicated in studies to understand how it happens. But it's a little bit of the virus. It's a little bit of our own immune system. So the most prominent if you had to point to one thing, it's our immune system and inflammatory response that we have that leads to these kind of issues. And sometimes it's just the bystander effect of the organ being at the same location or being in the bloodstream or the blood flow of that infection, and then that leads to damage. And that is the concern. Really, it's not always about death. It's the long-term consequences you might have from getting infected. So if you're a runner and you like to run, you may not be able to do that anymore after a solid infection, even though you're young and you're healthy. So these are all concerns that we have about getting COVID and, of course, long-term having these issues.
The name of this is, correct me if I'm wrong, histocompatibility complex. This feature of your body to be able to disclose or discern you versus something that's not you. But if your body has that capability, why does it destroy the organ in going after COVID or whatever that particular virus is? Like, what's the thing that your body kind of mistakens when it's going after the organ in this case? These kind of autoimmune issues.
So most of the time it's what's called bystander effect. It's just that there's a virus there and it's trying to get rid of it. And it's just, it's doing everything. The immune system is trying to do everything it is to get rid of that foreign pathogen, the foreign invader. And then, of course, it gets localized sometimes to a tissue and, of course, causes issues there. And there's some hereditary, genetic factors involved with this. So there are some people that have a higher incidence of these inflammatory responses causing these issues. And there's even differences between sexes. So males and females. Females typically go through several phases in which they can actually have higher damage to certain targets or have this acute inflammation that can lead to damage of tissues. So these are all things that we, well described, but poorly understood yet. We're still working on them.
Okay, so that may have slightly answered the question with the COVID one. Do they understand the means by which COVID has been able to, I guess, create these type of issues? Like, it's one thing to have this kind of respiratory issues like a cold or something else, but COVID seems to have a host of issues associated with it. In some cases, this kind of brain fog. In other cases, people losing their sense of smell. In some cases, organ damage. Is there a single, let's say, a single line or a single methodology or feature of COVID's activity within the body that is causing all of these other ancillary symptoms?
Probably a little bit of it's the fact that we've never been exposed to this virus before, and I would say the other part of it is the kind of attention that's being paid to this. There are other acute infections, even common colds and flus that have the same symptoms, same long-term effects that people typically you see in lower numbers. But again, we've been exposed to flu over our lifetime, so seeing those and being aware of them is less likely. So this is a new virus, and of course, it's a lot of attention being paid to it.
What are the means that your body used to try to get rid of COVID, or for that matter, any other virus, but COVID specifically? Meaning when your immune system kind of gets involved and your immune system realizes either sniffing the waste that comes out of the cell that basically exploded, or basically coming across, okay, there's something here that doesn't belong here. How does your body go about trying to eliminate, let's say, the virus, as opposed to trying to eliminate, let's say, a bacteria? Or are those methods similar?
Very similar methods. Typically, the first step is to put a fever in place. And so, a fever essentially reduces the ability for both viruses and bacteria to grow quickly, and it slows everything down. It puts them at a temperature that both our body doesn't like, and of course, the organisms don't like. And then you have what's called an innate immune response that's before that occurs that says, hey, there's something here that shouldn't be. And the innate immune response is it's a very ancestral immune system that we've had for a long time that doesn't require to see something very unique. It just looks for pathogen-specific patterns. And then on the immune side, when you have an adaptive immune response of T cells and B cells, and of course antibodies coming from the B cells, those are more specific, and they are actually part of that major histocompatibility complex, the MHC we just mentioned before. And what happens is those get presented on top of the cell, and then there's cells that recognize that, B cells and T cells, and say, hey, this isn't me. This is something other than me, and I need to respond to it. And there's a bunch of checkpoints and control points in there to make sure that it doesn't get carried away. And in some people it does. And so that's what that whole type of issue is. And that's why we have autoimmune diseases, because sometimes your MHC presents something that's self, and then of course you respond to it and you cause issues to yourself.
So they basically tag the cell. Okay, it's like something's wrong with the cell. And in tagging the cell, the other elements of the body or the immune system basically can attack that particular cell.
And it lets everybody know, and it makes a kind of a signal to say bring the forces here. So bring everything we can to take care of this. And it has very delicate tools in it that actually says, hey, this is what we think the organism might be, and we know how to respond to it in that manner.
Very interesting. What does it use? What methods does it use to get rid of it? I mean, does it eat it? Does it? And I know eat it sounds weird, but I guess I'm trying to get a mental image of what it looks like when it's going to war with the various organisms.
Way of saying it, eating it, it's called phagocytosis. So we'd like to call it some fancy name, but it's actually eating it. So there are cells that come in and eat the cell. There are other cells like T cells that come in and target it and kill that cell, and they basically cause it to break up in little pieces that can be more easily eaten. So it's almost like a pre-digestion, you can imagine. But it also tells the cells around it that, hey, there's something here that shouldn't be here. And those cells start to take on different effects, too, where they can slow down and they can actually self-monitor and actually increase the amount of monitoring that goes on. And this happens every day in your body because that's normally what would happen with a cancer cell or a tumor cell, is the same things happen. So it's not just for pathogens. It's designed for both, malignant cells and, of course, these, organisms that try to get into us.
That is profound. I mean, yeah, that is profound. I mean, the capability of the body in order to basically, I guess, defend itself. And
it's under monitoring. It's always under monitoring. It's like a home alarm system.
Wow. And so when AIDS first came about, why was, okay, I guess that brings a more interesting question. When AIDS first came about, why was that one seemingly so, I don't know, it seemed to be different. I mean, was it because AIDS had the ability to basically attack the immune system and undermine the very immune system that needed to attack the virus? What was the difference in the way that AIDS was propagating in the immune system and the way the immune system tried to regard it as opposed to something like COVID?
So COVID doesn't have a tendency to become integrated into our genome. It's basically there to infect and then to explode in replication and then get back out. HIV, unfortunately, targets, like you said before, it targets T cells and macrophages, the cells that eat other cells through phagocytosis and other methods. And what it does is it basically gets into them and either replicates and kind of makes a quick spread amongst the different cells in your body, or it goes into the genome, and it actually always goes in the genome and becomes latent and just hides. So it's a double whammy on why it is an acute disease. You get an acute phase, and basically people get infected and they have a little fever, don't even recognize it, and then in most cases, and then of course it's integrated into your genome at that point, and then slowly it replicates and it starts killing off these really important cells that we need in our body for immunity.
Wow, it just seems like there's an intelligence, either from the standpoint of the virus or from the standpoint of the way your body is regarding the virus.
Absolutely, it's one of the reasons us, the scientists, that we get so excited about this and so nerdy about it is such an elegant and interesting battle that goes on at a level that none of us can see.
One of the other issues that came up had to do with the study recently on natural immunity versus the immunity from the vaccine. And for the longest time, I believe it was either the CDC or the WHO had been saying that even if a person had COVID, that they should get vaccinated. Well, you had a bunch of anti-vaxxers and other people who were dubious about either the vaccines or getting any kind of treatment for the virus, who were like, well, wait a minute, if I'm already naturally immune, why should I go about getting the vaccination? Well, some of the research that basically recently came out kind of made the point that the natural immunity is weaker than the vaccination. Is that correct? And can you explain a little bit about that?
So there's been reports of the vaccination being less potent than being infected, and there's of course the papers you were mentioning earlier that show that the virus actually, the infection actually does not give you the same protection that you would through a vaccination. The problem with this is that it's all about virus load and what you were exposed to. So if you were exposed to very little virus, you had an almost asymptomatic disease, you'll have very little protection against COVID. And then there's difference in our genetics, too, where some people who have the same level of infection will actually have different levels of immunity that's generated just based on that system we talked about and how it's so complicated. So it's not surprising that we're going to see studies that say that, if you're COVID infected, you have really strong protection, because there are people that will have that type of protection. There'll be a lot of people in the bell curve that will be below that. So it's highly likely that there's people out there that don't have protection after a COVID infection. And we know with coronavirus is that in a single season from fall to winter, you can get the same virus twice. So this family of viruses tends to have a waning immunity. So it's likely that vaccination does boost your immunity and gives you a stronger response, probably more so than someone who just got vaccinated. So there's a value in being vaccinated in either case.
So wait, same virus, even same variant. Like it's not okay, the person had, let's say, the basic variant of COVID or the basic COVID and then had a Delta variant of COVID. You're talking about they can get the exact same COVID case twice.
So, and what I'm speaking of is other coronaviruses. So there's other viruses that are in the coronavirus family, like COVID, and they cause what we call some of the common colds. There's a lot of viruses that cause common colds, but the common cold that you usually get in the fall and the winter, it can be coronaviruses. And it's known that you can get the same virus, usually a variation. It's not quite a variant, but a variation that will come back in the spring and you'll get it again.
Oh, I see. And in this case, though, if a person, let's say, had asymptomatic COVID, and tell me if I'm wrong, I'm just trying to extrapolate basically on what you were saying. If a person caught COVID once before, and let's say it was somewhat asymptomatic, then based on the viral load not necessarily being that high, that person may not necessarily have internal defenses in a way that's significant enough to deal with a secondary case if they come in contact with it again, where the viral load might have been higher. Meaning that, yes, the person might have had it, but their natural immunity might not have developed with a certain degree of significance because the initial case wasn't that bad. Whereas the second case, especially if it was far more significant, basically overwhelms whatever natural immunity the individual had before that was created the first time around.
Absolutely. I had a personal case, a colleague of mine that actually caught the disease from someone who had been infected 2 months before and got reinfected 2 months later with likely the same variant, and unfortunately passed away from the disease because of that infection. So it's totally possible that someone who has a non-durable or low protection immunity can actually get reinfected.
2 months. Wow.
2 months.
Oh, that is so unfortunate. That is greatly unfortunate.
They took the kind of resilience or the idea behind, well, I've been infected and I should be protected against anything. And so that unfortunately didn't work out for my colleague.
That wasn't necessarily true. Oh, man, that is so unfortunate. From the standpoint of the vaccines at this point, I mean, the efficacy is still intact mostly. What needs to take place regarding the vaccinations? I mean, is this something where there's need to be a whole new rework? I mean, meaning, I guess what I'm asking is, has the variance between the original vaccination that was created earlier in the year changed drastically enough where the vaccine needs to be basically reworked with, I guess, a new strand or a new item to give a heightened immunity to what we're encountering now for the Delta variant? I mean, I think it was Friday, I believe there were over 2,000 deaths, like 2,500. Over the weekend, 1,878. And we've been basically having maybe 2,200 on average every day for the last several weeks. Does this, and even among people who basically are vaccinated, where we've had these breakthrough infections, yes, the overwhelming majority of the people who are in a hospital and filling hospitals and ICUs and everything else are people who who are unvaccinated or have gone for a very, very long time where the efficacy of it starts to wane. But are we at a new point where a new vaccine would need to be created in order to accommodate what we're encountering now?
So the vaccine strategies that are being proposed now are much like what you're saying, is to look at the common variant that's floating around the world globally. So by sequencing the virus globally, we can kind of get an idea of what the threats might be. And it might be a threat that's not really spread yet, but could be something of high interest because of the certain changes that have occurred. This is exactly what we do with all flu every year. We look at the flu variants that are circulating every year and make decisions on what that vaccine will look like for the year for the vaccine. And that's how we make the flu vaccine. So you can imagine that something similar will happen with COVID-19, likely even part of a annual flu vaccination. The other idea that's out there is to make a universal COVID-19 vaccine like we are trying to do for flu.
Yeah.
Again, very tough target, probably 5 or 6 years away from being able to do that. And there's even a more interesting idea is to make a universal coronavirus vaccine that would stop all the human coronaviruses plus any of these emerging viruses. So that's a step further that could be of value to mankind.
Wait, how would that work? I mean, because it seems like the moment that variation started to come into play, that you start to get breakthroughs or this kind of differential between how your body was dealing with the initial phase of it with the virus and with the vaccination, as opposed to the efficacy going down after the fact? I mean, is it even possible to come up with one suiting all in this case?
So it's been a long goal of influenza to make a universal vaccine, so we would only get one vaccination per year and maybe less, maybe 5 years. And the data says it can be done, both the data that's in animals and, of course, the data looking at retrospective human samples. There are people that are well protected over time with certain vaccinations. So it's possible. It's just a large step to move to that next level. For COVID-19, it's definitely possible to make a universal vaccine. It's just a matter of figuring out what the proteins will be needed to do that and where they're conserved and where we can actually target the virus.
We're sending kids back to school now, and Governor Newsom has basically put in for kids to get vaccinations. He's basically mandating vaccinations for kids as they go back to school. School to me seems like a perfect storm. And it seems like the worst case scenario to basically send kids into the school system. I mean, and it seems to be bad on a few counts. We know that there could be breakthrough infections, especially with the Delta variant. So even people with vaccinations can potentially still get ill and pass the illness, even if that number is less. And we're basically putting them into confined spaces. So it's a confined space with a potential deadly virus. We also know, or at the very least strongly suspect, that when kids go home, those kids are not going to be wearing masks 24/7 at home, meaning whatever parents, elderly or otherwise, they're basically going to be exposed to whatever the kid brings into the household. It seems like this is kind of an opportunity for a significant spread event to take place. I mean, am I being too, cynical here when I think about this? Or
no, I've wondered the same thing, and it's again, in society as a whole, there's those that follow the rules appropriately, and there's those that don't follow the rules. So if everybody followed the rules and you follow everything that's, like you said before, like they keep their 6 foot distances, all the ventilation's taken care of, and all the other factors are put into place, you'd be pretty safe. But we are really just kind of making a hotbed of possible cases that can then go back home, and of course cause to those children that have immunosuppressed conditions, or usually undiagnosed, don't even know that they have those situations, or they have someone at home who's very vulnerable. This makes it very difficult to control the infections, and likely part of the reasons we're seeing the numbers of deaths per day that we're continuing to see.
That is unfortunate. Dr. Jean, we're about to close. But before I close, is there anything, I guess there's 2 questions to close it. Have there been any new treatments in regards to people with COVID that has basically come down the pike in trying to, grapple with people who actually has it or who's been affected with it? Has there been any additional medical breakthroughs in regards to treating it, short of course, the pills? And I guess the last question would be, what are your concerns going forward as we move, into this year or the end of this year and into the next year regarding this virus?
I think the pipeline, we call it the drug pipeline for both vaccines and therapeutics, there's quite a few promising ideas, and they're not really breakthroughs for the general press until they reach a certain stage of their development. So I'm seeing very interesting drugs from various organizations that are looking at trying to stop this virus, and so it's exciting to see that. And a lot of these probably have use in other viral diseases, so that's exciting as well. And there's a lot of government effort to look at that as well. My biggest concern moving forward is that we tend to forget what we've learned in the past, and this is one coronavirus. There's 4,000 other coronaviruses we know of that exist in other animals that could jump species at some point. And there's a huge virome, the total viruses that are in the population, that also contain a lot of viruses that could cause a lot of problems for mankind as a whole. So if we don't spend the pennies now, we end up spending billions, and so we got to continue to move forward to help build the knowledge, including these messenger RNA vaccines. These were all built 20, 30 years ago based on basic research that was going into science. So we need to continue that and not just dismiss it.
Well, that's a good question. Why now? Like, why with the mRNA vaccines or the mRNA, let's say the medication, because basically we're using the mRNA to create a vaccine, but the mRNA technology is not necessarily a vaccine in and of itself. Why did it take so long for these to become effective? Is it just this was, the perfect creating the vaccination with the mRNA technology was just worked Like it was one of those things that kind of fell in line, whereas some of the other things that they were trying was a little bit too extravagant. What was the difference here?
The difference is that literally 30 years ago, these were all put into development by a group of individuals that I'm still trying to sort out who was responsible. I'm working on a review of this, but some individuals in government and industry basically came together and said, we need to prepare for the next pandemic. And they started thinking about how can we do this in an effective way versus what, it took us more than 100 years to come up with the first vaccines for some of the pathogens that were causing mankind dread in the early 1900s. So how can we reduce that down to a very short period of time, both drugs, vaccines, and the ability to produce them? And there was a tremendous effort that went into this by the government. And that's what yielded this result. Messenger RNA vaccines were supposed to go into people this year. Last year. They were supposed to go into people and under clinical trials for a variety of different vaccines for use, including like cytomegalovirus and things like that, that are necessary for transplant patients and other conditions. So, these were already on the line to be developed. It's just that people don't pay attention to this type of science until it's, a pandemic.
That's uber interesting. So even if COVID never came to fruition, the mRNA vaccines were still going to come to fruition this year already.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep. There were several clinical trials that were planned in 2020, 21. So, yeah.
What else can this be used for? Like epilepsy or other kind of diseases? What are they planning to use the mRNA technology for going forward? And this could be the last question.
No, it can be used for vaccinations. It can be used for therapies. Therapeutics can be placed in them. We actually, the group I worked with, looked at putting monoclonal antibodies, which are the ability to make the monoclonals in vivo. So you could literally have the ability to protect yourself against Lyme disease, for example, for the whole summer, and then take the vaccine the next spring and have it again and be protected. There's a whole new technology called CRISPR that's even way more advanced than messenger RNA. So there's lots of promising approaches that both have been found, kind of as really smart scientists figure it out. And then, of course, others, because government said, hey, we need a plan. And so there's a lot of opportunity here to better mankind's welfare and, of course, the ability to live a good life.
Wow. Dr. Ollinger, thank you. I really appreciate this. I always appreciate these conversations. You're very knowledgeable on this subject matter. The voice that you guys are listening to is Dr. Gene Ollinger. He's a professor at Boston University, the principal science advisor for MRI Global, and recipient of the NIH Director Award in 2015 for his efforts assisting with the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. He also conducted and supervise in vitro and in vivo experiments in maximum biocontainment, focusing on high-consequence pathogens and biodefense. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We will be back in a moment taking your calls. The number 202-521-1320. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
What do we want? News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. You guys are listening to the last, 10 minutes at this point. I am accepting your phone call. The number is 202-521-1320. It is 202-521-1320. Look, I always appreciate Dr. Gene Ollinger coming onto the show and give us his experience. He clearly has been doing this for years. He definitely knows what he's talking about, and he has a certain degree of gravity when he can explain this stuff in ways that oftentimes I would make the case don't necessarily get explained all that well. There's another item that came out also we didn't necessarily get the chance to get to, but a preprint study that overstated the risk of myocarditis following COVID-19 vaccination with withdrawn Reuters and lead story report. And I'll just read it. A preprint study conducted at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute was withdrawn after it was discovered that the study had erroneously calculated the rate of how many people experience myocarditis, which is an inflammation in the middle layer of the heart wall, after receiving a COVID-19 vaccine. Reuters reports. The CDC reports that as of July 16th, 8.9 million children aged 12 to 17 have received the Pfizer vaccine. Of the population, 9,249 people self-reported cases of side effects, and 4% of those were myocarditis. Facts reports. COVID-19 is known to cause heart problems in those who contract the virus, according to doctors, meaning that whether it's the vaccine or whether it's the virus in and of itself can also cause heart problems, not to mention other cases of organ damage. So, look, you know how I take this. In my mind, it's get vaccinated. It seems to be the safer of the alternatives. And even in the case that he was able to explain, even getting the virus itself, yes, it may create a natural immunity, but the natural immunity may be not significant enough to deal with a worst case of the virus. So shout out to Dr. Jean for coming on to the show and explaining everything you ever wanted to know about COVID, but didn't have anyone to ask. Also, I want to thank Carl Jha. Earlier on today, I think it was at the 7 o'clock hour, he was explaining the politics or the geopolitics between China and Taiwan. There were several reports about Chinese air warfighters basically flying near Taiwan. I mean, the media reporting here in the United States made it sound as if it was flying over Taiwan, but basically it wasn't necessarily over the country of Taiwan. It was more so in this kind of zone that Taiwan has unilaterally called its own. And, you know, the point that Jazar was making was that, look, it doesn't necessarily seem like it's leading to any kind of war per se. And he would admit or agree that it is on some level provocative. But it's kind of a freedom of navigation exercise, kind of like the United States does its own freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. The difference here is that China considers Taiwan to be its own territory under this notion of a one China policy. And for the most part, the United States, up until the point where Donald Trump took office and basically made that call and basically this kind of Asian pivot, well, the U.S. also had this policy in addition to this kind of strategic ambiguity where they wouldn't make this hard notion as if Taiwan was its own independent actor or independent state. Jha made the point that any notion that Taiwan is independent from China at this point would be a red line and would create a certain degree of, well, it would be provocative, to put it mildly. And that would be one of those cases that countries would have to look out for. It's called the ADIZ zone. And Jha made the point that said Taiwan basically unilaterally created this zone. Some of the zone is even over China, and that it is not necessarily acknowledged by the Chinese. The U.S., right here, I just read it. The U.S. has asked China to cease aggressive actions over Taiwan. Now, this has to do with Ned Price. Ned Price of the State Department spokesman has basically been putting out tweets and been talking to reporters on this particular issue. I got to be honest, I am unsure on what the United States believes it can do if China decides to get involved with either taking Taiwan. And further, is the United States willing to go to some kind of war in order to protect the integrity of Taiwan as being somewhat of a quasi-independent actor? How many Americans are they willing to get killed for the defense of Taiwan? And I don't have an answer to that, and I would hope the answer is zero. And we also had the opportunity to talk to Ted Rall today. Ted Rall, phenomenal, having this conversation on the intra-party fighting with the Democratic Party, lefties holding the line with Christian Sinema, and, of course, Joe Manchin basically not holding the line. Well, they are holding the line in a way for their moderates and for their donors. But this has been Fault Lines, guys. And Shane may be back tomorrow or at the very least the next day. I want to give a shout out to the engineers. I want to give a shout out to the producers. And I want to give a shout out to you, our listeners. And I want to thank you for joining us. This is Fault Lines, Radio Sputnik, Jamarl Thomas. We'll be back tomorrow. You guys have a great day.